She cooked every meal in that small suburban kitchen, scrubbed every floor until the linoleum gleamed, raised every child with patient and tireless devotion, and then, when the cupboards grew bare and the milk bottles emptied, she had to walk into the living room, stand quietly beside her husband's armchair, and ask him for permission to spend money on the food her own family would eat. She was 30 years old, or 35, or 42. She held a college degree, perhaps, or had worked as a secretary or a nurse before the wedding ring slipped onto her finger. She managed a household budget that ran into the thousands of dollars each year. She raised future doctors and engineers and senators, and yet, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the bank, in the eyes of her own husband, she was treated financially as something not quite an adult. The system had a polite name. It was called the housekeeping allowance, and it controlled the lives of millions of American and British women throughout the long, polished, manicured decade of the 1950s. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. So settle in tonight, somewhere warm and quiet, somewhere the lights are low and the world feels far away. Pull the blankets up around your shoulders. Let your breathing slow, and let us drift gently backward through time, back through the soft hum of decades, back to a world of polished chrome and pastel curtains, of milkmen on suburban streets and station wagons in driveways, of women in shirtwaist dresses standing at kitchen windows, watching the children play in yards that were not yet fenced, back to 1954, to 1957, to 1961, back to a time when the American dream was being built one ranch house at a time, and when behind every gleaming new refrigerator, behind every freshly waxed kitchen floor, behind every casserole dish steaming on a Formica countertop, there was a woman who could not, by law or by custom or by quiet, suffocating habit, spend a single dollar of her own household's money without first asking her husband if she might. This is the story of those women, of how they lived, of how they shopped, of how they begged, in small ways and large, for the means to feed the families they had built. It is a story of polite suburban streets and the quiet desperation that lived just behind the lace curtains. It is a story of a system so woven into the fabric of daily life that most people did not even see it as a system. It was simply, in the language of the time, the way things were. Let us begin in a small kitchen, in a small house, on a small street, in a small town somewhere in Middle America. The year is 1955. The hour is just after 7 in the morning. The light is pale and soft through the gingham curtains. A woman, perhaps 28 years old, stands at the stove in a cotton house dress and a clean white apron. Her hair is pinned back neatly. There is coffee percolating on the back burner. There are eggs frying in butter. There is bacon laid out in careful parallel strips. The radio plays quietly from the windowsill, soft music drifting beneath the hum of the refrigerator. The children are not yet awake. The husband sits at the kitchen table in his shirt sleeves reading the morning newspaper. He has not spoken in 9 minutes. She sets his plate before him. She pours his coffee. She straightens the napkin beside his hand. And then, with the kind of careful, practiced casualness that thousands of women employ thousands of times every morning across the country, she says something like this. She says, "The grocery money is nearly gone, dear. I will need a little more before Thursday, if that is all right." He grunts, he nods, he turns the page, and perhaps he reaches into his wallet and slides out a few crisp bills, and perhaps he does not. Perhaps he says, "What did you spend it on?" Perhaps he says, "You had $10 on Monday, where did it go?" Perhaps he says nothing at all, and the question hangs in the air unanswered, while she stands at the counter and pretends to be busy with the dishes, and the silence stretches out and the children begin to stir upstairs, and the moment passes without resolution, and she will have to ask again tomorrow. This was not poverty. This was not unhappiness necessarily. This was not even, in most cases, conscious cruelty. This was simply the architecture of married life in the 1950s, in millions of households across the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and Australia and much of the Western world. The husband earned the money, the husband held the money, the husband distributed the money, and the wife, no matter how competent, no matter how educated, no matter how essential to the running of the household, received what was given. She could spend it on groceries. She could spend it on diapers and dish soap and the children's shoes, but every dollar was watched, Every dollar was counted, every dollar required in some form the permission of the man who had earned it. And to understand how this system came to be, and how it functioned, and how millions of intelligent women learned to live within it, we must go further back still. Back before the suburbs, before the station wagons, before the gleaming kitchens and the chrome appliances, back to the very foundations of how money and marriage and womanhood fit together in the Western world. So let us begin our journey there. Let us go back, gently, slowly, breath by breath, into the world of the 1950s housewife, into her kitchen, into her shopping bag, into her purse with its careful inventory of coins, into her mind where she counted and recounted the dollars she had been given and tried to make them stretch one more day, one more meal, one more night before she had to ask again. The story begins, in some sense, long before the 1950s. It begins in the legal traditions of England, in a doctrine called coverture, which was carried across the Atlantic by the colonists and woven into the fabric of American law. Under coverture, a married woman had no separate legal existence from her husband. She could not own property in her own name, she could not sign contracts, she could not keep her own wages if she earned any. She could not, in many states, even keep custody of her own children if her husband decided otherwise. The legal phrase for this condition was feme covert, a covered woman, a woman whose identity was tucked beneath the legal identity of her husband, the way a small bird might be tucked beneath the wing of a larger one. And though the worst of these laws had been chipped away by the middle of the 19th century, by various married women's property acts in England and in the various American states, the spirit of coverture lingered far longer than its letter. It lingered into the 1950s. It lingered in the small, unspoken assumptions of daily life. It lingered in the bank teller who refused to open an account in a married woman's name without her husband's signature. It lingered in the landlord who would not rent to a woman without her father's or husband's guarantee. It lingered in the mortgage application that required a husband's income and ignored the wife's entirely. And so, when a young woman in 1952 stepped down the aisle of her local church, in her white satin gown with the lace veil and the small bouquet of white roses, she was stepping not only into a marriage but into a legal and economic structure that had been shaped over centuries, a structure that placed her, for all practical purposes, in a position of profound financial dependence. She did not, in most cases, think of it this way. She thought of it as love. She thought of it as partnership. She thought of it as the natural order of things. The man she had chosen would provide. She would care for the home and the children. They would build a life together. And this was, for many women, a happy and fulfilling arrangement, at least on the surface, at least for a time. But beneath the surface, the gears of the old system continued to turn. And nowhere did those gears turn more visibly than in the small, daily, weekly ritual of the grocery money. Let us return to that kitchen, to that woman in her apron at the stove, to the soft morning light through the gingham curtains. Let us look at her hands. They are not idle hands. They are hands that have been working since 5:45 in the morning, when the alarm clock rang and she rose before her husband, before her children, to begin the long and unbroken sequence of small tasks that made up her day. She started the coffee, she set out the breakfast plates, she unlocked the back door for the milkman, who would leave the glass bottles on the step before 6. She gathered the morning newspaper from the front lawn. She folded the dish towels that had dried overnight on the rack. She wiped down the counters that had already been wiped down the night before, because in 1955, in a good American kitchen, the counters were always being wiped down, the floors were always being swept, the dust was always being chased into corners and out the open back door. And by the time her husband sat down to his breakfast at 7, she had already worked for over an hour without pause. By the time he left for the office at 8:15, kissing her briefly on the cheek, and reminding her to have his good shirt pressed for the evening, she had already worked for over 2 hours. And the day, of course, was only beginning. The children would need to be dressed, fed, walked to the bus stop or the school gate. The beds would need to be made. The laundry would need to be sorted, washed, hung on the line in the backyard, brought in before the afternoon rain. The vegetables would need to be peeled and chopped for the evening meal. The casserole would need to be assembled. The cake would need to be baked for the church potluck on Friday. The grocery list would need to be written. And then, at some point in the middle of the day, she would need to walk or drive to the grocery store, and she would need to have money in her purse to do so, and that money would need to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was her husband. Now, the husband. Let us not paint him entirely as a villain. He worked too. He worked long hours at his office or his factory or his sales route. He commuted on crowded trains or in the family car. He came home tired, often weary, often quietly resentful of the pressures upon him. He believed, as the culture told him to believe, that he was the breadwinner, that the money he earned was his to manage, and that providing for his family was both his duty and his right. He did not, in most cases, see the grocery money as a humiliation imposed upon his wife. He saw it as good housekeeping. He saw it as financial responsibility. He saw it as the proper way to run a household, with one earner and one keeper, one provider and one steward. And the wife, for her part, often saw it the same way. The system was not, in most marriages, openly oppressive, it was simply assumed. But the consequences of that assumption were profound, and to see those consequences we must look at the small, quiet ways in which the housekeeping allowance shaped the lives of women, day by day, dollar by dollar, year by year, throughout the long decade of the 1950s. The first thing to understand is that the housekeeping allowance was not a single, uniform practice. It varied widely from household to household. In some marriages, the husband gave his wife a fixed weekly sum, perhaps $15 in 1950, perhaps $30 by the late 1950s, with which she was expected to manage all the household expenses. In other marriages, the husband gave money only as needed, dollar by dollar, in response to specific requests. In still others, the wife was allowed to charge groceries at the local store and the bill would be paid by the husband at the end of the month. And in a small minority of households, the wife was given access to a joint bank account, though even this access was often limited and watched. But across all these variations, the underlying principle was the same. The money belonged to the husband. The money was earned by the husband. The wife was, in some sense, a paid manager of household expenses, except that she was not paid, and the money she managed was not hers. She had to ask for it. She had to account for it. She had to justify it. And if she spent it wrongly, or if she ran short before the end of the week, she had to explain herself. Picture for a moment a Tuesday afternoon in 1957. A young woman, perhaps 26 years old, stands in the dairy aisle of the new supermarket that has just opened on the edge of town. The supermarket is brightly lit, the aisles wide, the shelves stacked high with cans and boxes and bottles. There are gleaming refrigerated cases full of milk and butter and cheese. There are great pyramids of grapefruit and apples. There are signs advertising specials, 10 cents off a pound of ground beef, 2 cans of soup for a quarter, a half pound of bacon for 39 cents. The woman has a list in her hand, neatly written in pencil on the back of an envelope. She has a small fabric coin purse in her handbag. Inside that coin purse is $12.47. That is the entirety of the household's available money until Friday afternoon, when her husband will receive his weekly paycheck and will, perhaps, give her a little more. She walks down the aisle slowly. She compares prices. She picks up a can of green beans, considers it, sets it back down, picks up the cheaper store brand instead. She weighs the choice between butter and margarine. Margarine is cheaper, and the children do not mind it. But her husband prefers butter on his toast in the mornings, and so she takes the butter. She calculates as she walks. A loaf of bread, 20 cents. A quart of milk, 24 cents. A pound of ground beef, 50 cents. A dozen eggs, 50 cents. A pound of bacon, 60 cents. A bag of flour for the week's baking, 38 cents. A box of cereal for the children, 27 cents. A small bag of coffee for her husband, 89 cents. The numbers add up in her head as she walks, and she watches her coin purse mentally shrinking, and she calculates what can be cut, what can be substituted, what can be done without until Friday. This was the daily reality of millions of women. Not poverty exactly in most cases, not even hardship in the most desperate sense, but a constant low-level mathematical anxiety, a perpetual juggling act, a continuous performance of frugality and ingenuity that consumed mental energy from morning to night. And the anxiety was not made easier by the fact that she could not, in most cases, simply take more money from the family savings. The savings, if there were any, were in her husband's bank account. The checkbook was in his desk drawer. The credit cards, where they existed at all in the 1950s, were in his name. She could not write a check. She could not draw cash. She could not, in most banks and most cities, even open an account of her own without his written consent. And so she made do. She walked the aisles of the supermarket with her $12.47, and she made it stretch, and she came home with brown paper bags full of carefully chosen necessities, and she unpacked them onto the kitchen counter and put them away in the cupboards in the icebox, and she began to plan the week's meals around what she had been able to afford. And if she ran short before Friday, if a child broke a glass and needed a new one, if the milk soured early in the warm weather, if a friend came to visit and she needed to put a little extra on the table, she would have to ask. And asking, no matter how loving the marriage, no matter how generous the husband, was never quite without weight. The grocery store itself was a recent transformation. In 1930, most American shopping had been done at small neighborhood shops. The butcher, the baker, the greengrocer, the dairy, each with its own counter and its own clerk, each requiring the customer to ask for items by name and have them weighed and wrapped and added to a running tab. By 1950, that world was rapidly disappearing. The supermarket, with its self-service aisles and its standardized packaging and its checkout lanes, had revolutionized the way American families shopped for food. The first true supermarket, King Cullen, had opened in Queens, New York in 1930. By the end of the 1950s, there were thousands of supermarkets across the country, and they had transformed not only how Americans bought groceries, but how Americans thought about food. For the housewife, this transformation was both a liberation and a new kind of pressure. The supermarket gave her more choice than ever before. She could push a metal cart down brightly lit aisles and select from a dizzying variety of products. She could read labels and compare prices and make decisions on her own, without the watchful eye of a counter clerk. But the supermarket also expanded the scope of her shopping. There were now more things to buy. There were new convenience foods and frozen vegetables and brightly coloured cereals and disposable paper products. There were advertising messages on every package and every end cap, urging her to try the new flavour, the new size, the new improved formula, and every choice meant a calculation. Every choice meant another small mental arithmetic against the $12.47 in her coin purse. She learned, over the years of marriage, to become an expert in the small economies of household management. She knew exactly how many slices of bread were in a loaf, and exactly how long that loaf would last for a family of 5. She knew when to buy whole chickens and cut them up herself rather than buying parts. She knew how to stretch a pound of ground beef into a meatloaf that would feed everyone for 2 nights. She knew how to repurpose Sunday's roast into Monday's sandwiches and Tuesday's soup. She knew the difference between the price of canned peas in January and canned peas in August, and she planned her shopping accordingly. She clipped coupons from the newspaper. She watched for sales. She memorized the layout of 3 different grocery stores and knew which one had the best prices on which items. She was, in every meaningful sense, a financial professional. She was simply a financial professional who was paid in groceries and who answered, every Friday evening, to a board of directors of 1. Outside the kitchen window, the suburban world of the 1950s unfolded in its strange and gleaming new shape. The streets were clean, the lawns were green, the houses were freshly painted, ranch houses and Cape Cods and split levels in soft colours. The mailman walked his route in a grey uniform with a leather bag over his shoulder. The milkman came in his white truck 3 times a week, leaving cold glass bottles on the front step. The children played in the yards and the cul-de-sacs and the empty lots between the new houses. The men drove off in the mornings in their suits and their hats, behind the wheels of large American sedans, their elbows resting on the rolled-down windows, their cigarettes burning slowly in the ashtrays. And the women, in their house dresses and aprons and pin curls, moved through their homes with the slow and steady rhythm of those who had no expectation of going anywhere else. This was the world of 1955. This was the world of the post-war boom. This was the world of the American dream, as it had been promised and as it was being delivered. And it was, for many people, a beautiful world. The houses were new, the appliances were new, the cars were new, the marriages were new, by and large, because so many of them had been formed in the great surge of weddings that followed the end of the Second World War, when the soldiers came home and the country exhaled at last, and millions of young men and young women set about building lives in the new suburbs that were springing up around every American city. But the beauty of that world rested upon a particular arrangement of labour and money, and that arrangement, when you looked at it closely, when you stood in that kitchen in the early morning light, and watched that young woman pour the coffee and slide the eggs onto the plate, was not entirely fair. The husband earned the money. The wife earned nothing. The husband worked 8 hours and came home to a hot meal and a quiet house and a press shirt for the morning. The The wife worked from before dawn until after the children were asleep, and her labour was invisible, uncompensated, taken for granted, and absolutely essential. And at the end of every week, when the paycheck arrived, the money went into his pocket and not hers, and she was given, in return for her 16-hour days, a small fold of bills with which to buy the bread and the milk and the meat. Let us think for a moment about what that arrangement felt like, from the inside. Not in the worst marriages, where the husband was cruel or stingy or controlling, though there were certainly such marriages, but in the average marriage, the perfectly ordinary marriage, the marriage between two reasonable people who loved each other and did their best. Even in such a marriage, even in the kindest and most loving of households, the housekeeping allowance carried a weight that was difficult to put into words. The wife knew, without being told, that the money was not hers. She knew that every time she opened her coin purse, she was spending something that belonged, in some legal and emotional sense, to someone else. She knew that if she wanted to buy something for herself, a new dress, a magazine, a chocolate bar, a small gift for a friend, she would have to either justify it within the housekeeping budget or ask her husband for additional money. And asking, even of a kind husband, was never quite weightless. It carried within it an acknowledgement of dependence. It carried within it a small, almost imperceptible request for permission. And over the months and the years of marriage, those small requests accumulated. They became habits. They became postures. They became, in the deepest sense, a way of standing in relation to the person who held the money. Many women in the 1950s developed elaborate strategies for managing this dependence without losing their dignity. Some kept a small private fund, hidden in a sugar tin in the back of the cupboard, or rolled up in an old stocking at the bottom of the dresser drawer. They saved nickels and dimes from the grocery budget, returning glass bottles for deposit refunds, taking small commissions from the milkman or the breadman for buying in bulk, doing piecework at home with their sewing machines and pocketing the proceeds. This was money that belonged, in some private and secret sense, to themselves. It was money for emergencies, or for small kindnesses, or for the rare extravagance of a hat or a tube of lipstick. It was, in a quiet way, an act of resistance. It was the housewife's way of carving out within the larger system of financial control a tiny private kingdom of her own. Other women became masters of indirect persuasion. They learned how to bring up the need for a new washing machine over Sunday dinner, when the husband was relaxed and full of pot roast, and the children were on their best behaviour. They learned how to mention, casually in the moments before bed, that the icebox was making a strange noise again. They learned how to plant the seed of a purchase in the husband's mind weeks before the actual money was needed, so that by the time the conversation came around to dollars and cents, he had already, in some sense, made the decision himself. This was, of course, a kind of manipulation, but it was also a kind of survival. It was the way that women without financial power exercised influence over financial decisions. It was the way that they got the new refrigerator, or the new vacuum cleaner, or the trip to the seaside for the children, without ever quite having to ask outright. And still other women, the bolder ones, the more frustrated ones, the ones whose husbands were difficult or stingy or simply oblivious, found ways to take small, quiet liberties. They padded the grocery bill by $1 or $2 each week and pocketed the difference. They told the husband that the meat had cost more than it had. They wrote down extra expenses that had never occurred. They lied in small and careful ways in order to claim some small measure of financial autonomy, and they did not, in most cases, feel guilty about this. They felt instead that they were taking what was rightfully theirs, in the only way that was open to them. Now none of this was, in the 1950s, considered a problem. None of this was discussed publicly. None of this was, for the most part, even discussed privately between husband and wife. It was simply the way the system worked. It was simply, in the language of the time, what marriage was. The husband earned. The wife asked. And no one, or almost no one, thought to question whether this arrangement might be, in some fundamental way, unjust. But there were murmurs, there were stirrings, there were voices here and there beginning to ask the question. And one of the loudest and clearest of those voices belonged to a woman named Betty Friedan, who, in the early 1960s, would write a book that would change everything. But we'll come to her later, in another act of this long night's tale. For now, let us return to the kitchen. Let us return to the gingham curtains and the smell of coffee and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Let us return to the woman at the stove in 1955, in her cotton house dress and her clean white apron, with the morning light just beginning to climb the wall behind her. She does not yet know that the world is going to change. She does not yet know that her daughters will grow up in a different country, a country where women can hold their own bank accounts and sign their own mortgages and earn their own paychecks and decide for themselves how much money to spend on a loaf of bread. She knows only this morning. She knows only this kitchen. She knows only the careful, patient work of feeding the people she loves with the money she's been given. And so she pours the coffee, and she slides the eggs onto the plate, and she sets it down before her husband, and she waits with quiet patience for the day to begin. Outside, the milkman is finishing his route. The children are stirring in their beds upstairs. The first of the neighbours is pulling out of his driveway, his car easing slowly down the smooth suburban street. The day, slow and ordinary and golden in the early light, is just beginning, and in millions of kitchens, in millions of houses, in millions of small American towns and suburban developments, the same scene is unfolding, with small variations and small differences and small private dramas. The husbands eat their breakfasts and read their newspapers and leave for their offices. The wives stand at their stoves and ask, in careful and practiced voices, for a little more money for the week's groceries. And the great machine of post-war American life turns over, smoothly and quietly, on its well-oiled gears. Let us settle deeper into the blankets. Let us slow our breathing. Let us drift gently through this world, this gleaming and ordinary world, this world of small kitchens and small budgets and small, daily acts of careful management. There is so much more to see. There is so much more to understand. There are so many more women whose stories we have not yet heard. And we will hear them, slowly, patiently, one by one, as the night deepens around us and the world grows quiet and the long, slow journey into sleep begins. The morning light shifts. The hour passes. The young woman in the kitchen finishes the breakfast dishes and dries her hands on the cotton dish towel that hangs from the handle of the oven door. The radio plays softly on the windowsill. A song drifts out of the small speaker, a man's voice singing about love and longing, and a girl named Mary, accompanied by a slow, gentle orchestra. The woman hums along quietly as she moves about the kitchen, putting away the cereal box, wiping down the toaster, sweeping a few stray crumbs from the floor with a small whisk broom. She's thinking as she works about the day ahead. There is the laundry to do. There is the ironing to start. There is the meatloaf to prepare for tonight's dinner. And there is the grocery shopping which will need to be done sometime after lunch, before the children come home from school. She walks to the small notepad that hangs by a string from a hook beside the icebox. She picks up the stub of pencil that hangs beside it. She begins to write her list. Milk, 2 quarts. Bread, 1 loaf. Eggs, 1 dozen. Butter, 1/4 pound. Ground beef, 1 pound. Onion, 2. Potatoes, 5 pounds. Carrots, 1 bunch. Bacon, ½ pound. Coffee, small can. Soap powder, 1 box. She pauses. She looks down at the list. She does the calculations in her head. Each item adds up. The total grows. She compares it, mentally, to the money in her coin purse. It will be close. It will be tight. There may not be enough for the small luxury she had been thinking about, the can of fruit cocktail that the children love so much, or the small block of cheddar cheese that her husband likes on his crackers in the evening. She erases nothing from the list. The essentials are essentials, but she does, in her mind, prepare herself for the small disappointment of having to leave the fruit cocktail and the cheese on the shelf. She has done it before. She will do it again. It is, she tells herself, simply a matter of priorities. The children need milk and bread and meat. The luxuries can wait until next week, when perhaps her husband will be in a generous mood and will slip an extra $1 or 2 into the housekeeping envelope. The housekeeping envelope. Let us pause for a moment on this small and now mostly forgotten object. In countless American and British households in the 1950s, the weekly distribution of money from husband to wife took place through the medium of a plain white envelope. Sometimes it was a real envelope, like the kind one would use to mail a letter. Sometimes it was a small fabric pouch, embroidered or plain. Sometimes it was an old purse, kept just for this purpose, or a small tin box on a high shelf in the cupboard. But the principle was the same. On Friday evening, or Saturday morning, or whenever the husband received his paycheck and went to the bank to cash it, he would return home with a stack of bills, count out a certain portion of them, and hand them to his wife. The amount was usually consistent week to week, though it might vary slightly with the season or with special expenses. The wife would take the bills, count them quietly, and tuck them into the envelope or the pouch or the tin. This was her budget. This was what she had to work with. This was the household economy in physical, tangible form. And throughout the week, she would take from this envelope as needed. She would extract a few dollars before going to the grocery store. She would take out a quarter for the milkman, a dime for the newspaper boy, a few cents for the church collection on Sunday. She would pay the iceman in households that still used ice, or the coal man in the colder months, or the man who came to read the gas meter. The envelope grew lighter, day by day, until by Thursday night it was usually nearly empty, and on Friday morning she would have to be especially careful with her purchases, because there was always the slight worry that the new money might not come, or might come late, or might come less than expected. It was a small object, that envelope, but it represented in physical form the entire structure of household financial life in mid-century America. It represented the boundary between the husband's money and the wife's spending. It represented the act of distribution, the act of permission, the act of trust and dependence that lay at the heart of so many marriages. And it represented, too, the deep and unspoken assumption that money was a male thing, that its earning and its keeping and its bestowing were the rightful business of men, while women were the agents of its spending, the channels through which it flowed outward into the world of household consumption. Now, this assumption did not arise from nowhere. It had deep roots, as we have already begun to see, in the legal traditions of coverture and in the centuries of practice that those traditions had supported. But it had also been reinforced in powerful and specific ways by the experiences of the early 20th century, and especially by the long shadow of 2 world wars and a Great Depression. Let us drift for a moment backward through time. Let us leave the 1950s kitchen and travel gently to an earlier world. Let us go to 1944, to a small house in a small town somewhere in the American Midwest, where a different woman, a slightly older woman, is at work. The Second World War is in its final year. Her husband is overseas, fighting in Europe or in the Pacific. She has not seen him in 18 months. She has 2 small children to raise, and she is doing it in his absence with a remarkable degree of independence and competence. She has a job. She works 5 days a week at a factory that has been converted to make airplane parts. She earns her own paycheck, the first money she has ever earned in her life that was entirely hers. She has her own bank account, opened with the cooperation of a sympathetic bank manager who has been willing to make exceptions during wartime. She makes her own decisions about how to spend the money. She buys her own groceries. She pays her own bills. She decides, on her own, what cuts of meat to buy and what brand of soap to use, and whether to take the children to the cinema on Saturday afternoon. She is, for the first and perhaps only time in her life, a fully independent financial actor. And she finds, somewhat to her own surprise, that she is rather good at it. This was the experience of millions of American and British women during the war years. They worked in factories, in shipyards, in offices, in farms, in every kind of position that had been vacated by the men who had gone off to fight. They handled their own money. They managed their own households without the daily oversight of husbands. They became, in a remarkably short space of time, accustomed to a kind of independence that their mothers and grandmothers had never known. And then the war ended, and the men came home, and the women by the millions were quietly and firmly pushed back out of the workforce, back into the kitchens, back into the housekeeping allowance system that had been waiting for them all along. It was, in many ways, the great undoing of the 20th century's first feminist revolution. The independence that women had won during the war was not, for the most part, retained. The jobs they had held were given back to the returning veterans. The bank accounts they had opened were closed, or merged with their husbands' accounts. The paychecks they had earned were replaced with the small Friday envelopes of housekeeping money. And the country told itself, through its movies and its magazines and its advertisements and its sermons, that this was the right and natural order of things, that women belonged in the home, that the husband was the breadwinner, and the wife was the keeper of the hearth, and that this was how it had always been, and how it always should be. But the women remembered. They could not entirely forget. They remembered what it had felt like to hold their own paychecks. They remembered what it had felt like to make their own decisions. They remembered what it had felt like to walk into a bank and not be treated as a child. And though they returned, by and large quietly and without protest, to the system of the housekeeping allowance, there was, in many of them, a small seed of restlessness that had been planted, and that would, in the decades to come, begin to grow. Back to the 1950s kitchen, back to the soft morning light and the smell of coffee and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. The young woman has finished her grocery list. She has tucked it into the small leather handbag that hangs from the hook by the back door. She has put on a fresh apron, the one with the small embroidered flowers along the hem, the one she keeps for going out into the world. She has checked her hair in the small mirror beside the icebox and pinned a stray curl back into place. She has taken her car keys, if she's one of the lucky women whose family owns a second car, or she has put on her good walking shoes, if she's one of the many who must walk or take the bus. And she has, last of all, opened her coin purse and counted the money once more. $12.47, 11 days until the next paycheck. She closes the purse with a small, decisive click. She walks down the front step of her small house and out into the world. The day is warm, perhaps, with the soft heat of an American summer, or it is crisp with the cool air of October, or it is grey and damp with the soft rain of an early spring morning. Whatever the weather, she walks out into it, with her shopping bag over her arm and her small leather handbag at her elbow, and she sets off toward the grocery store, toward the supermarket, toward the small everyday transaction that will, for the millionth time in her life, require her to make a long series of careful financial decisions on behalf of her family, with a budget that does not quite belong to her, in a world that does not quite see her as a full economic actor. Let us follow her gently through the streets of her town. Let us walk beside her as the houses pass by on either side, as the lawns and the gardens and the picket fences slip past. Let us notice, as she walks, the small details of the world she lives in. The white houses with their black shutters, the maple trees that line the streets, their leaves turning gold and red in the autumn or green and full in the summer. The children's bicycles left lying in driveways, the morning newspapers still folded on front steps, the hum of distant lawnmowers, the smell of bread baking somewhere, or coffee brewing, or the first faint whiff of smoke from a backyard barbecue. This was the small-town world of 1950s America. It was a world of remarkable surface uniformity. The houses looked alike. The cars looked alike. The clothes the people wore looked alike, by and large. The grass was the same shade of green from one yard to the next. The mailboxes were painted the same colours. The shutters were trimmed in the same crisp white. There was, in this uniformity, a kind of comfort. There was a sense of belonging, of fitting in, of being part of something larger than oneself. There was the deep post-war relief of having survived the great trauma of the war years and the slow, steady pleasure of building, brick by brick and lawn by lawn, a peaceful and prosperous national life. But beneath this uniformity, of course, there were countless small variations. Some houses were happier than others. Some marriages were more equal than others. Some women, in those quiet kitchens and on those quiet streets, were more content with their lot, and others were not. And some, a small but growing number, were beginning in the privacy of their own minds to wonder whether the lives they were living were quite what they had been told to expect, whether the trade they had made of independence for security, of paychecks for housekeeping envelopes had been entirely fair. But these thoughts, in 1955, were still mostly private. They had not yet been spoken aloud. They had not yet been organised into movements, or written into manifestos. They were, for the most part, the quiet murmurs of women in their own heads, as they walked to the grocery store with their small budgets and their long shopping lists, as they stood in the dairy aisle comparing the prices of butter and margarine, as they handed over their carefully counted dollars at the checkout counter and received their pennies of change in return. The young woman in our story reaches the grocery store at last. It is a new building, built within the past 2 or 3 years, with large plate glass windows and an automatic door that swings open as she approaches. The store is bright inside, lit by long fluorescent tubes that hum softly overhead. The aisles are wide, the floors are polished, the shelves are stacked with hundreds, perhaps thousands of different products, in cans and boxes and bottles and packages, each one labelled and priced and waiting to be chosen. She takes a metal cart from the row by the door. The cart rolls smoothly on its small wheels. She pushes it ahead of her, into the first aisle, which is the produce section. She begins, slowly, to walk. She picks up apples and turns them in her hands, looking for bruises. She weighs a small bunch of carrots against another, slightly larger bunch, calculating whether the difference in size is worth the difference in price. She bends down to choose potatoes from the great wooden bin, selecting medium-sized ones that will boil quickly and store well. She places each item in the cart with care. She is already, in her head, totalling the cost. The grocery shopping of the 1950s housewife was not a casual affair. It was not a quick errand to be dispatched between other tasks. It was, in its way, a serious and demanding form of work. It required attention, calculation, judgment, and an extensive store of practical knowledge about food, about prices, about seasons, about the cooking and storage of dozens of different ingredients. It required the ability to plan a week's worth of meals in advance, taking into account not only what the family liked to eat, but what could be made in advance, and what would keep in the icebox, and what would be needed for the school lunches, and what would be appropriate for Sunday dinner if relatives came to visit. And it required, above all, the ability to do all of this on a fixed and limited budget, with no possibility of running over without serious consequences. She moves through the aisles slowly, past the canned vegetables, past the boxes of cereal, past the bottles of milk and the cartons of eggs and the rolls of butter in the refrigerated case. She compares prices on every shelf. She picks up 2 cans of soup, looks at the labels, considers them carefully, returns one to the shelf and places the other in her cart. She walks past the small bakery section and lingers for a moment over a small pie, a cherry pie, freshly baked that morning, sitting in the case behind glass. The pie costs 65 cents. She thinks about it. She imagines her husband's face when he sees it on the dinner table tonight, with vanilla ice cream perhaps, or just plain. She imagines the children's delight. And then she calculates the money in her purse, and she calculates the remaining items on her list, and she decides, with a small private sigh, that the pie is not in the budget today. She walks on. This was perhaps the deepest and most invisible cost of the housekeeping allowance system. Not the dollars themselves, not even the time and effort required to manage them, but the small daily denials. The pie left in the case, the dress left on the rack, the hat left on the shelf, the chocolate bar left in the candy aisle, the small, ordinary, harmless pleasures that were, week after week, year after year, quietly forgone because they did not fit into the budget. And the woman, of course, did not feel sorry for herself. She did not, by and large, think of these denials as deprivations. She thought of them as good housekeeping. She thought of them as being a responsible wife and mother. She thought of them as the sensible and proper way to manage the household. But the small denials accumulated. They became habits. They became, in some sense, postures of the soul. And over the years of marriage, of motherhood, of careful weekly grocery shopping with carefully counted dollars, the woman became, in subtle ways, smaller. She became more cautious. She became more frugal in her wants as well as in her spending. She became perhaps less able to imagine pleasures for herself, less able to remember that she had once been a young woman with dreams and desires and appetites that were not entirely about feeding other people. The system shaped her, in the deepest sense. It shaped not only what she spent her money on, but what she felt entitled to want. And yet, let us not paint this picture too darkly. The young woman in our story is not unhappy. She is, in fact, perfectly content most of the time. She loves her husband, she adores her children, she takes pleasure in her home, in her kitchen, in the small daily rituals of cooking and cleaning and tending to the people she loves. The cherry pie left in the case is a small disappointment, yes, but it is balanced by 100 small satisfactions throughout the day. The smell of her own bread coming out of the oven, the sound of the children's laughter from the backyard, the feel of clean sheets on a freshly made bed, the quiet pleasure of a Sunday afternoon with the family gathered around the dinner table. These are real pleasures, they are real consolations, they are the warp and weft of a life that is, by many measures, a good life. And the woman walking through the supermarket with her metal cart and her carefully counted dollars would, if you asked her, tell you that she is happy. She would tell you perhaps that she is grateful for her husband and her children and her home, for the prosperity of her country and the peace of her times. She would tell you that she has everything she needs. And yet, somewhere underneath, in a place she rarely visits even in her own thoughts, there is a small quiet space where another version of herself still lives, a version who once worked at the factory during the war and held her own paycheck in her own hand. a version who once dreamed of being a teacher or a nurse or a journalist, before the wedding ring slipped onto her finger and the housekeeping envelope replaced the paycheck and the kitchen replaced the office. That version of herself is mostly silent now, but she is not entirely gone. And on certain quiet afternoons when the children are at school and the house is empty and the laundry is hanging on the line in the backyard, the woman will sometimes feel her, like a small presence at the edge of her awareness, like a forgotten song trying to be remembered. But not today. Today she is shopping. Today she is choosing potatoes and weighing carrots and comparing the prices of 2 brands of canned soup. Today she is doing her job, the job she has chosen, the job that society has chosen for her, the job that is both her duty and her devotion. And she does it well. She does it with skill and care and patience. She does it with $12.47 and a long shopping list and a small leather handbag and a metal cart that rolls smoothly down the polished aisles of the new supermarket on the edge of town. She reaches the checkout at last. She unloads her items onto the conveyor belt one by one, watching as they slide forward toward the cashier. The cashier is a young woman, perhaps 18 years old, with a kind smile and quick fingers. She rings up each item on the cash register, her hands moving rapidly over the keys, the bell of the register chiming softly with each new entry. The total grows: $8.50, $9.20, $10.10, $11.45. The young woman holds her breath just slightly. She watches the numbers climb: $11.90, $12.15, $12.38. The cashier pulls the lever. The drawer pops open. The total appears on the little paper tape: $12.38. The woman exhales. She has 9 cents to spare. 9 cents, which she will tuck back into her coin purse, and which will, over the course of the week, be combined with other small coins and pennies, until perhaps, by the end of the month, she has accumulated enough for some small private purchase, a magazine or a tube of lipstick or a small bag of candy for the children to share on a rainy Saturday afternoon. She counts out the bills, hands them to the cashier, receives the 9 cents in change and bags her own groceries while the cashier moves on to the next customer. She walks out of the store with 2 large brown paper bags balanced in her arms, the smell of fresh bread rising from one of them, the cold of the milk bottle pressing against her side. She loads the bags into the back seat of her car, if she's driven, or settles them into her shopping basket on wheels, if she has walked, and she begins the journey home through the same streets she came on, past the same lawns and the same maple trees and the same white houses, with their black shutters and their picket fences. The day continues, the hours pass, she arrives home, she unpacks the groceries, she puts them away in the cupboards and the icebox. She begins the preparations for the evening meal, and in millions of houses in millions of small American towns, the same sequence of actions is unfolding, by women who do not know each other and never will, women who share nothing except a country and a time and a system that they have inherited and that they will pass on, in some altered form, to their daughters. Let us pause here. Let us let the afternoon settle around us. Let us watch the slow, golden light of the late 1950s drift through the kitchen windows and across the linoleum floors. Let us listen to the soft sounds of the houses, the gentle ticking of the clocks, the quiet hum of the refrigerators, the distant sound of children playing in the streets. Let us breathe deeply. Let us settle further into the blankets. Let us let the world of 1955 wrap itself around us slowly and gently, like a soft and faded quilt that has been passed down through the generations. There is so much more to see, so much more to understand, so many more small kitchens and small budgets and small daily negotiations to walk through. The night is still young, the journey is still long, and the great slow story of how women in the middle of the 20th century lived their daily lives, in dependence and in dignity, in frustration and in fulfillment, is only just beginning to unfold. Sleep if you can, or simply listen. Either way you're welcome here. The kitchen is warm, the bread is rising, the coffee is on the stove, and the world, for all its quiet imperfections, is at peace. Let us drift gently outward, beyond the kitchen, beyond the small suburban house, with its picket fence and its trim green lawn, beyond even the small American town where our young woman is putting away her groceries. Let us drift across the country, across the wide expanse of the United States, and pause for a moment in the cities, the great American cities of the 1950s, where the same drama of housekeeping and grocery money was unfolding in different forms, in different settings, in different rhythms. In the apartments of New York and Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston, the wives of factory workers and dockmen and railroad clerks and shop assistants were managing their own versions of the housekeeping allowance, with smaller budgets and tighter constraints. The grocery store was not always a gleaming new supermarket. It was often the small neighborhood market on the corner, run by a husband and wife from the old country, with sawdust on the floor and salami hanging from the ceiling and the smell of pickles and bread and fresh ground coffee filling the air. The woman would walk to this store every day, or every other day, with her shopping basket over her arm. She would speak to the grocer by name, and he would speak to her by name in return. He would weigh out her 1/4 pound of cheese and her 2 pounds of potatoes. He would slice her bread and wrap it in brown paper. He would write her purchases in a small ledger book if she could not afford to pay that day, and she would settle her account at the end of the week when her husband brought home his pay. This was a more intimate form of the same system. The grocer knew her. The grocer knew her husband. The grocer knew in some sense the entire economic life of the family. And the woman, in the small neighborhood market, was both more visible and more constrained. She could not, as the suburban housewife could, walk anonymously through the aisles of a vast supermarket, making her choices in private. Every choice she made at the corner store was witnessed, recorded, woven into the social fabric of the neighborhood. If she stretched the budget too far, the grocer would notice. If she tried to charge too much on credit, the grocer would mention it kindly but firmly to her husband when he came in on Saturday morning to settle up. There was no privacy. There was no anonymity. There was only the daily round of small transactions, watched and counted by a dozen pairs of eyes. And yet, in the urban apartment buildings of the 1950s, there was also a kind of solidarity that the suburban housewife often lacked. The women knew each other. They saw each other on the stairs, in the hallways, at the laundry line on the roof, at the corner store, at the church on Sunday morning. They borrowed cups of sugar and shared recipes and watched each other's children when one of them had to run an errand. They commiserated in small and quiet ways about the difficulties of stretching the dollar, about the rising prices of meat, about the new advertisements in the magazines that made everyone want things they could not afford. They were, in their small and crowded world, a community of mutual support and quiet understanding. The suburban housewife, by contrast, was often more isolated. The houses on her street were spread out, each on its own lot, with its own driveway and its own backyard. The neighbours might be friendly, but they were not in most cases close. The husbands knew each other from the train into the city, perhaps, or from the country club, or from the Rotary lunches. But the wives saw each other only briefly, in the driveways at the end of the day, or at the school where they brought their children, or at the supermarket where they pushed their carts down opposite aisles. The suburb was, by design, a place of privacy, and privacy for the housewife often meant loneliness. She was alone in her kitchen for most of the day. She was alone with her vacuum cleaner and her ironing board and her piles of laundry and her endless small tasks. She was alone with her budget and her shopping list and her quiet calculations about how to make the dollars stretch one more day. And though she might have telephoned a friend across town or driven over for a coffee with a neighbour when the children were at school, the central fact of her daily life was solitude. She was, in some deep sense, a single point of consciousness in the middle of a large and beautiful and lonely house, performing a long series of necessary tasks with no one to talk to, but the radio on the windowsill and the cat curled up on the kitchen chair. This isolation was not accidental. It was, in some sense, the product of a series of deliberate choices that had been made by planners and developers and politicians and businessmen in the years after the Second World War. The new suburbs had been designed for cars, for nuclear families, for the post-war ideal of single-family home ownership. They had been built on the assumption that the husband would commute to the city for work, that the wife would stay home with the children, that the family would gather in the evenings around the kitchen table or the new television set, and that the larger community of urban life, of street life, of corner stores and neighbourhood bars and front stoop conversations would be replaced by the smaller community of the single household, contained within its own walls and its own yard and its own carefully tended green lawn. And this design, for all its many comforts and conveniences, had the effect of concentrating the labour of the housewife and the isolation of the housewife in a way that earlier generations had not experienced. The grandmother of our young woman, perhaps, had lived in a small apartment in the city, where her work was visible to her neighbours and where she could chat with them across the courtyard, or in the corridor or at the open window. The mother of our young woman, perhaps, had lived in a small house in a small town, where she could walk to the market and to the church and to her sister's house, all within a few blocks, and where her social world was woven into the rhythms of her daily errands. But the young woman herself in the new suburb of the 1950s was different. Her house was newer, larger, more comfortable. Her appliances were more modern, her clothes were nicer, but her world was smaller in some ways. Her community was thinner. Her daily life was more contained, more solitary, more private. And the housekeeping allowance fit, of course, into this new design. The husband drove off in the morning with the money in his wallet into the larger world of business and commerce and public life. The wife stayed home, with the small folded bills in her envelope, in the contained world of the house and the yard and the supermarket on the edge of town. The boundary between the two worlds was clear. The husband's world was big and noisy and full of money. The wife's world was small and quiet and full of carefully counted dollars, and the small daily ritual of asking for grocery money, of receiving the weekly envelope, of returning the change in the form of dinners and clean shirts and well-behaved children, was the small daily ritual by which the two worlds remained connected. But let us not stay too long in this analytical mood. Let us return instead to the gentle particulars of daily life. Let us return to the small kitchen and the soft afternoon light and the woman putting away the groceries. She unpacks the brown paper bags. She places the milk in the icebox. She puts the bread in the bread box. She arranges the cans of soup on the shelf above the stove. She washes the carrots and the potatoes and sets them on a small rack to dry. She puts the butter on the small porcelain dish that her husband's mother gave them as a wedding gift, the dish with the small blue flowers around the rim. She closes the cupboard doors. She wipes down the counter. She folds the brown paper bags carefully and tucks them into the drawer below the sink, because the brown paper bags will be reused, of course, for school lunches and for wrapping packages and for 100 other small purposes. Then she takes off her good apron and puts on her work apron, the one with the deeper pockets and the stained patches and the slightly faded checks. She washes her hands at the sink. She takes a deep breath. She begins the preparation of the evening meal. Tonight is meatloaf night. It is Tuesday, and Tuesday is always meatloaf night in this household, just as Monday is always pot roast, and Wednesday is always casserole of some kind, and Thursday is always chicken, and Friday is always fish, because they are Catholic, or because their Catholic neighbours are, and the rhythms of the religious calendar have woven themselves into the rhythms of the weekly meal plan. Saturday is something special, often steak or a roast chicken if the budget allows. Sunday is the big family meal, ham or beef or a whole roasted chicken, with all the trimmings. The weekly menu is as predictable as the seasons, and the housewife knows, on any given afternoon, exactly what she's preparing and exactly how long it will take and exactly when it will need to go into the oven. She takes out the pound of ground beef she purchased that afternoon. She places it in a large yellow mixing bowl. She adds bread crumbs, made from yesterday's stale bread, ground fine in the small metal box grater that she keeps in the drawer beside the stove. She adds a beaten egg. She adds a finely chopped onion, sautéed lightly in butter. She adds salt and pepper and a small dash of Worcestershire sauce. She adds a quarter cup of ketchup mixed into the meat and saved for a small glaze on top. She mixes everything together with her hands, the cool meat squeezing between her fingers, the smell of onion and beef rising into the warm kitchen air. She shapes the meatloaf into a loaf pan. She covers it with the small glaze of ketchup. She places it in the oven, which she has preheated to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. She sets the timer for an hour. She washes her hands again. She moves on to the next task, which is peeling the potatoes for mashed potatoes, and after that the green beans for the side, and after that the small dessert, which will be a chocolate pudding made from a box because she did not have the money for the cherry pie, and the box of chocolate pudding mix has been sitting in the cupboard for 2 weeks waiting for an occasion. The afternoon passes. The children come home from school, banging through the back door with their books and their lunchboxes and their stories about the day. She gives them a snack, a glass of milk and a few cookies from the jar on the counter, and she sends them out to play in the yard until dinner. The dog comes in from the porch, where he has been napping in the warm afternoon sun, and curls up on the kitchen rug at her feet. She continues to work, peeling and chopping and stirring and checking the oven, and the meatloaf begins to fill the kitchen with its rich, warm, familiar smell. Outside, the streetlights come on one by one as the sun begins to dip behind the line of maple trees at the end of the street. The neighbourhood grows quieter. The other husbands begin to come home, their cars turning into their driveways, their headlights briefly sweeping across the windows of the house. Her own husband's car will arrive at 6:15, give or take a few minutes. He is regular in his habits. She has the dinner ready for 6:30 every night, because that is when he likes to eat. She lays the table. She uses the everyday plates, not the good china, because it is Tuesday. She sets out the silverware, the forks on the left and the knives on the right and the spoons above the plates. She folds the napkins, paper napkins from the dispenser on the counter, and tucks them under the forks. She places the small glass salt and pepper shakers in the centre of the table. She fills the water pitcher and sets it beside her husband's plate. She arranges the small bowl of pickled beets that she made last week, and the small dish of bread and butter, and the small saucer of olives. Everything is in its place. Everything is ready. And then she goes to the small mirror in the hallway, the one beside the front door, and she checks her reflection. She straightens her hair. She removes her apron and hangs it on the hook in the kitchen. She smooths her dress. She applies a small touch of lipstick from the tube in her pocket. She's presenting herself in this small and almost unconscious gesture to the man who is about to walk through the door. She is, in some quiet way, dressing for company, except the company is her husband, the man she's known for 8 years, the man she's been married to for 6. She's making herself, in the small ways she can, into the version of herself that he expects to come home to. And she does this without resentment, without weariness, without much thought at all. She does it because it is what she does. She does it because it is her job. The car turns into the driveway at 6:14. She hears the engine cut. She hears the door slam. She hears her husband's footsteps on the front walk, on the porch, at the front door. The door opens. He comes in. He hangs his hat on the hook beside the door. He hangs his coat in the small closet. He calls out a hello to the children, who are now in the living room watching the small black and white television set in the corner. He walks into the kitchen. He kisses her briefly on the cheek. He says, "Smells good." He says, "What's for dinner?" she tells him. He nods. He goes into the bathroom to wash his hands and change out of his suit jacket. She begins to bring the food to the table, the meatloaf sliced into thick portions on a serving platter, the mashed potatoes fluffy and white in a large bowl, the green beans tossed with a small pat of butter, the pickled beets, the bread. She calls the children to the table. They come in, scrubbing their hands on their pants legs, sliding into their seats. Her husband returns, in his shirt sleeves now, and sits down at the head of the table. They bow their heads. He says grace, briefly and quietly, the same words he has said every night for years. They lift their heads. They begin to eat. The dinner is good. The meatloaf is moist. The potatoes are creamy. The children eat with appetite. Her husband compliments her on the meal, briefly, and she smiles and thanks him. The conversation is light. He talks about something that happened at the office, a small dispute with a colleague that has been resolved. She listens. She nods. She asks a question or two. The children chatter about school, about their friends, about a story their teacher told them. The radio plays quietly in the corner, a soft melody from a big band. The candles, if it is a special night, flicker gently. The dog sits beside the table, hoping for a scrap of meatloaf to fall. This is family life. This is the moment, this is the warm and golden moment that the whole long day has been building toward. This is what the cooking is for. This is what the shopping is for. This is what the careful counting of dollars and the long walking through the supermarket aisles is for. This is the small reward, the small daily payoff, the small moment of belonging and warmth and shared bread that makes the whole structure of the day, of the week, of the long and steady years of marriage and motherhood feel worthwhile. And so, even if the system that produced this moment was unjust, even if the housekeeping allowance was, in some structural sense, a form of financial infantilization, even if the wife was, in some deep and unspoken way, less powerful and less free than her husband, the moment itself was good. The moment was real. The food was warm and the children were healthy and the husband was kind on most nights, and the family was, in the deepest sense, together. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the 1950s housewife. She was not, by and large, a victim. She was not, by and large, unhappy. She was a real woman, living a real life, making real choices within the constraints she had inherited, finding real pleasures and real meaning in the work she'd been given to do. It is only when we step back, when we look at the whole structure, when we count the dollars and trace the legal restrictions and consider the long historical context, that we can see the system for what it was. The system was unjust. The system was, in its design and in its implementation, a form of financial control that limited women's freedom in deep and lasting ways. But the women themselves, the actual women, the actual wives and mothers and daughters who lived within that system, were not simply prisoners of it. They were participants in it. They were shapers of it. They were, in their small daily acts of management and economy and love and care, the people who made the system work, who made the houses warm, who made the meals appear on the tables, who made the children grow up healthy and happy and well prepared for the wider world. And we should honour them, these women. We should honour them not by pretending that their lives were easy, or by pretending that the system was fair, but by seeing them clearly, by recognising both the difficulty of what they did and the dignity with which they did it, by understanding that the small daily acts of grocery shopping and meal preparation and household management were not small at all, were in fact the very foundation upon which the whole prosperous and gleaming post-war world was built. Let us sit for a moment in the gentle aftermath of the family dinner. The plates are scattered. The candles, if there were any, are burning low. The children have asked to be excused and have wandered off into the living room to watch the rest of their television programme. The husband has pushed his chair back and lit a cigarette. The radio plays softly. The dog is finally being slipped a small piece of bread under the table by the youngest child. She begins to clear the dishes. She carries them 2 at a time to the sink. She runs the hot water. She adds a small squirt of dish soap. She begins to wash, slowly and methodically, plate by plate, fork by fork. Her hands are red from the hot water. Her dress is damp from the splashes. She thinks as she works about the day, about the grocery trip, about the careful counting of dollars, about the cherry pie left in the case, about the meatloaf that turned out well, about the small contented smile on her husband's face as he ate, about the children's chatter and the dog's hopeful eyes and the soft music from the radio. It has been a good day, she decides, a good day in a long string of good days, and tomorrow will be another such day. She will rise at 5:45. She will make the coffee, she will fry the eggs, she will pack the lunches, she will send the husband off to work and the children off to school, she will do the laundry and the ironing and the cleaning and the cooking, and in the afternoon, perhaps, if her husband leaves her enough money in the envelope, she will take a small walk to the corner drugstore and buy a magazine with a beautiful woman on the cover and articles about new recipes and new fashions and new advice about how to be a better wife and mother, and she will sit briefly on the back step in the late afternoon sun, and she will read and she will dream for a few minutes of a life she does not have but might once have wanted, and then she will fold the magazine carefully and put it in the drawer beside her bed, and she will go back into the kitchen to begin the preparation of the evening meal. This is her life. This is the life of millions of women like her. This is the life of the 1950s American housewife, and though it is, by any measure, a limited life, a constrained life, a life that does not extend much beyond the boundaries of the house and the yard and the supermarket and the school, it is also a real life, a meaningful life, a life that is held together by 10,000 small acts of competence and care. Let us settle here for now. Let us let the dishes air dry in the rack beside the sink. Let us let the kitchen grow quiet. Let us let the late evening shadows climb the walls and the soft hum of the refrigerator fill the silence. Let us let the family gather in the living room around the small television set for the evening's entertainment. Let us let the day end gently, as it has begun, with the slow and steady rhythm of an ordinary American life. The night is deepening, the blankets are warm, the story continues, and there is so much more to slowly and softly explore in the long quiet hours that lie ahead. Let us travel now, gently, across the Atlantic Ocean, and pause for a while in the country of England, where the same drama of household money was unfolding in its own particular British form. The year is still 1955, and we find ourselves in a small terraced house in the suburbs of London, perhaps in Wimbledon or Putney or Ealing, where a young woman, married for 4 years, is preparing the evening meal in a kitchen that is rather smaller and rather older than the one we have just left in America. The walls are painted in a soft cream colour. The window over the sink looks out onto a tiny back garden where the laundry is drying on a line stretched between two iron posts. The stove is a small gas range with 4 burners. The icebox, or rather the small refrigerator, hums in the corner. The tea kettle sits on the back burner, always ready, always within reach. In Britain, the housekeeping allowance had its own particular character. It was called simply the housekeeping, as in, has he given you the housekeeping yet this week? As in, the housekeeping is running short. As in, she manages on a very tight housekeeping, the poor dear. The word had become, over generations, both a noun and an institution. It was the money the wife received. It was also the work she did with that money. It was the entire economic universe within which she operated. And it was by the 1950s as deeply embedded in British married life as it was in American married life, though with certain particular British inflections. For one thing, Britain in the 1950s was still climbing out of the long shadow of the Second World War. The country had been bombed. The country had been bankrupted. The country had been, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, on rationing for many basic goods, including meat, butter, sugar, tea, and clothing. The young woman in our London kitchen had, until quite recently, been managing her household with a small ration book, in which the family's weekly allotments were carefully recorded and stamped by the local shopkeeper. The end of rationing in 1954 had been a moment of national celebration. But the habits of austerity, the deep frugality, the careful counting of every shilling and every pence, had not disappeared simply because the ration books had been retired. They lingered in the bones of every British housewife of that generation, shaping her relationship to money and food and household management in ways that her American counterparts, who had not experienced rationing in the same way, did not entirely share. She manages, this young British woman, on a housekeeping of perhaps £3 10 a week. Out of this sum, she must purchase the family's food, the small daily necessities of the household, the children's small expenses, the milk delivery, the bread delivery, the newspaper, the soap, the coal for the small fire in the parlour in winter, the small jar of jam to spread on the morning toast. She must do all of this with the careful precision of a small accountant. She keeps a notebook, in fact, in the drawer of the small kitchen table. In this notebook she records, in pencil, every penny spent and every penny received. She balances the book at the end of each week. She knows to the shilling what she has spent on what. And if there is a discrepancy, even of a few pence, she will hunt for it, in her purse, and in her pockets, and in the small jars on the shelves, until she has found it and accounted for it. This level of financial precision was not unusual. It was, in fact, more or less expected. The British housewife of the 1950s was raised, from her own girlhood, to be a careful and conscientious manager of household money. She had watched her own mother do it, during the war and before. She had read the newspaper columns and the magazine articles that instructed her on the proper way to keep household accounts. She had absorbed, from 1,000 small sources, the cultural ideal of the thrifty, sensible, hard-working British wife who could make a sixpence stretch where a less competent woman would have spent a shilling. And she took, in her precision, a kind of quiet pride. She was good at her job. She knew how to manage. She could feed a family of 4 on her £3 10 and still have a few pence left over for a Saturday afternoon treat. But of course the housekeeping allowance was still, in its essential nature, the same as the American version. The money came from the husband. The wife asked for it. The wife was accountable for it. The wife could not, in most cases, simply spend money on her own initiative outside the boundaries of the housekeeping budget. If she wanted a new dress, or a new hat, or a small holiday at the seaside, she would have to either save it out of the housekeeping over many weeks and many months, or she would have to ask her husband for special additional funds. And the British husband, by and large, held the family money as firmly as his American counterpart. He worked at a bank or an office or a factory, depending on his class and his trade. He brought home his weekly wages or his monthly salary. He paid the bills. He managed the savings account. He owned the house or the lease on the house. He drove the car if the family owned one. He made the large decisions about money. And he gave his wife her housekeeping every Friday or every Saturday morning, with greater or lesser ceremony depending on his particular character. In some marriages, the giving of the housekeeping was a brief and businesslike affair. The husband counted out the bills. The wife took them. They both moved on to other things. In other marriages, it was a more elaborate ritual, with the husband perhaps inquiring after how the previous week had gone, whether there had been any unexpected expenses, whether the children needed any new clothes. In a small minority of marriages, the giving of the housekeeping was a source of regular tension, with the husband questioning every expense, the wife defending her management, and small recriminations flying back and forth across the kitchen table. In the worst marriages, of course, the housekeeping became a tool of cruelty. There were husbands who deliberately gave too little, knowing that their wives would have to come back later in the week and ask for more, just to enjoy the small moment of power that came from being asked. There were husbands who delayed the giving of the housekeeping until the very last moment, when the cupboards were nearly bare and the wife was beside herself with worry. There were husbands who, in the worst cases, spent the family money on drink or on gambling or on other women, and gave their wives only a small fraction of what they had earned, leaving the household perpetually short. These were, of course, the extreme cases. They were the cases that filled the social work reports and the divorce court records and the heartbreaking pages of the women's magazines, where the advice columns were full of letters from wives whose husbands were cruel or wasteful or simply incompetent with money. But these extreme cases, though they existed, were not the norm. The norm was the ordinary marriage, the kind marriage, the marriage in which both partners did their best, and the housekeeping was managed without too much friction or too much resentment. And yet, even in the ordinary marriage, even in the kind marriage, the system carried its weight. The British housewife in 1955 was no more able than her American counterpart to open her own bank account without her husband's signature. She was no more able to take out a loan or to sign a contract or to make a large purchase without his consent. She had no legal right to a share of the family savings if the marriage ended. She had no legal right to be paid for the work she did in the home. She was, in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the bank manager, and in the eyes of much of the larger society, a dependent. And the small weekly ritual of the housekeeping, however kindly it was practiced, was the daily reminder of that dependence. Let us watch this young British woman for a while. Let us see her as she goes about her afternoon. She has finished her morning's housework, the dusting and the polishing and the bed-making. She has washed the breakfast dishes and the lunch dishes. She has hung the morning's washing on the line in the back garden. She has now sat down for a brief moment in the small armchair beside the kitchen window with a cup of tea in her hand. The tea is hot and strong with milk and one small lump of sugar. The cup is white china with a faded blue pattern, a wedding present from her grandmother. She holds it carefully. She blows gently on the surface to cool it. She takes a small sip. This is her break. This is the small moment of rest that she has carved out of her long day. It will last perhaps 10 minutes. After that, she will need to start on the preparations for the evening meal, which tonight will be a simple stew with bread and butter and a small bowl of stewed apples for dessert. But for these 10 minutes she sits and rests. She looks out the window at the back garden. She watches the laundry sway gently in the breeze. She thinks about the day. She thinks about her husband, who will be home in 3 hours. She thinks about her 2 small children, who are at the small primary school down the road and will be home in 2 hours. She thinks about her mother, who lives across town and whom she has not visited in nearly a fortnight. She thinks briefly about her own life, and whether it is going as she expected, and whether she is happy. The honest answer, she decides, is that she is mostly happy. She has a good husband. She has 2 healthy children. She has a small but comfortable house with a small back garden where she can grow a few flowers in the summer. She has a kind mother-in-law who lives nearby and helps with the children sometimes. She has a small circle of friends, mostly other young wives in the neighbourhood, with whom she has tea on Wednesday afternoons. She has the church, where she goes on Sunday mornings with the family. She has the small daily pleasures of cooking and reading and listening to the wireless in the evenings. She is, by any reasonable measure, a fortunate woman. But there is something. There is, in the quiet of her afternoon tea break, in the small private moment of sitting alone in her own kitchen, a faint and barely articulated sense that she had once expected something else. She does not quite know what she had expected. She does not quite know what she had wanted. She had, when she was a young girl, before the war, before her marriage, before her 2 children, dreamed vaguely of being a teacher, or perhaps a librarian, or perhaps something in the world of books and learning. She had been a clever girl in school. Her teachers had praised her. She had even briefly gone to a small teachers' training college after the war. But she had met her husband there, and they had married within the year, and the teaching had been set aside for the marriage, and now, 6 years later, the teaching feels very far away. She does not regret her marriage. She does not regret her children. She would not, if you asked her, undo any of the choices she has made. But there is, in her quiet afternoon, a small sense that she might have been something else, that she might have done something else, that the world might have in some other version of itself opened a different door for her than the one she's walked through. And this small sense is not, in 1955, something she speaks about. It is not something she dwells on. It is not something she even quite admits to herself most of the time. It is simply there, in the background, like the soft hum of the refrigerator or the distant sound of children playing in a neighbour's yard. She finishes her tea. She sets the cup in the saucer. She rises from the small armchair. She goes to the kitchen counter and begins to peel the carrots for the stew. The afternoon continues. The work of the household continues. The small private thoughts are folded away gently into the deep pockets of the day. And let us, while we drift in this gentle moment, consider for a while the question of why so many women, in so many countries, in so many marriages, accepted the housekeeping allowance system without significant protest. It was not, after all, that women were ignorant of their condition. It was not that women were stupid or unaware. It was not that women lacked the capacity to imagine a different way of organising the household economy. Many women, in fact, were sharply aware of their own dependence, were privately frustrated by it, were occasionally angered by it. And yet in the great majority of marriages the system continued week after week, year after year, without significant challenge. There are many reasons for this. The first is simply the weight of custom. The housekeeping allowance was the way things had always been done. It was the way one's mother had done it, and one's grandmother, and one's great-grandmother. To challenge it would have been to challenge a structure that ran very deep, that was woven into the very fabric of what marriage meant. And most women, like most men, were not in the business of challenging the structures of marriage. They were in the business of making marriages work, of building families, of raising children, of getting through the days as well as they could. The second reason is the lack of viable alternatives. A married woman in 1955 who challenged her husband's control of the family money had few options. She could not, in most cases, easily get a job that would pay enough to support herself and her children. She could not, in most cases, easily get a divorce. Divorce was still socially stigmatized, expensive, and legally difficult in most American states and in Britain. A woman who left her marriage, especially if she had no independent income and no marketable skills, faced a very uncertain future, and so the calculation for most women was simply that the housekeeping allowance, however imperfect, was better than the alternatives. It was better than poverty. It was better than social ostracism. It was better than losing the children, which was a real possibility in many divorce cases, where the courts could and did award custody to the father if the wife was deemed unfit or unable to provide. The third reason is the genuine emotional bond that existed in most marriages. The young woman in our London kitchen loved her husband. She loved her children. She loved her home. The financial arrangement of her household was not, for her, a primary site of conflict or resentment. It was simply the way things were, and the small daily moments of intimacy, of partnership, of shared meals and shared evenings and shared parenting were, for her, the heart of the marriage. The housekeeping was a small and necessary feature of the larger landscape, but it was not the landscape itself. The fourth reason is the absence, in the 1950s, of any large public conversation about these issues. Feminism, as a political movement, had largely gone quiet after the achievement of women's suffrage in the early 20th century. The great waves of feminist organising of the 1910s and the 1920s had, by the 1940s and 50s, mostly receded. The new wave of feminism, which would emerge in the 1960s, with the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and the founding of organisations like the National Organisation for Women, was still some years in the future. And in the absence of a public conversation, in the absence of organised political pressure, in the absence of a language for naming the problem itself remained in some sense invisible. It was not a problem because it was not named. It was simply the way things were. And so the women of 1955 managed. They made do. They worked hard, all day every day, with very little compensation, and very little recognition and very little legal protection. They lived within a system that limited them in profound ways, and they did so, by and large, without complaint, because there was no clear way to complain, no clear audience for the complaint, no clear language with which to articulate the complaint. They simply lived. And in their living they shaped the lives of their children, the futures of their daughters, the slow, great transformation of the world that would come in the decades after the 1950s, when the daughters of the housewives would begin to ask, in numbers and in voices that could not be ignored, why the world was arranged this way and whether it could be arranged differently. But all of that is still to come. Tonight we are still in 1955. Tonight we are still in the small London kitchen with the cream-coloured walls and the small gas stove and the back garden full of laundry. And the young woman is still peeling the carrots for the stew, slowly and patiently, while the late afternoon sun moves across the floor and the day continues its slow and steady course toward evening. Outside, on the small terraced street, the milkman is doing his second delivery of the day. The breadman has come and gone. The coalman in winter would have come earlier in the morning. The postman has dropped 2 letters through the slot in the front door. The neighbours next door are having a small argument that drifts faintly through the shared wall. A bird is singing in the small tree by the front gate. The day is moving slowly and unstoppably toward its end. She finishes the carrots. She moves on to the potatoes. She begins to brown the small cubes of beef in a pan of melted dripping. The smell of cooking rises into the kitchen. The kettle, on the back burner, begins to whistle softly. She moves it off the heat. She works. She thinks. She is at peace, in some sense, with the day, with her life, with the small constraints of her world. She has done her best. She will do her best again tomorrow, and the small daily acts of love and care and management will continue, unbroken, into the long quiet future of her life. Let us leave her now, gently. Let us let her finish her stew in peace. Let us drift onward, into other kitchens, other countries, other corners of this great and quiet domestic world of the 1950s, where the small daily drama of the housekeeping allowance is unfolding in 1,000 different forms, in 1,000 different houses, in the long, warm afternoon of the post-war world. The night is deep now. The blankets are warm around us. The story continues. Let us drift with it slowly into the next chapter of this gentle journey. Let us travel further still, to other parts of the English-speaking world, where the housekeeping system carried its own local colours and textures. In Australia, in the suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, the young housewife of the 1950s managed her household on a weekly allowance from her husband, who worked at the bank or the brewery or the factory, and who brought home his pay each Friday in a small brown envelope, which he opened on the kitchen table while his wife watched, and from which he counted out a portion for the housekeeping. The Australian housewife had her own particular concerns. She had to manage the very hot summers, when food spoiled quickly and the small icebox in the kitchen struggled to keep things cold. She had to think about the supplies for the long summer holidays, when the children would be home from school for 2 months and the husband would, perhaps, take the family for a fortnight to the beach. She had to plan for the harshness of the Australian climate, the dust, the heat, the occasional water restrictions in dry years. In Canada, in the suburbs of Toronto and Montreal and Vancouver, the housewife had different concerns, of long cold winters and short hot summers, of furnace bills and snow shovels and the particular Canadian rhythm of life that swung between the long warm patio season and the deep snow months when the children had to be bundled up in scarves and mittens and snow pants before they could even go to school. The Canadian housewife managed her housekeeping with the same careful precision as her sisters in the United States and Britain. She knew the price of milk and the price of bread and the price of beef. She kept her account book. She balanced her weekly budget. She asked her husband when necessary for additional funds. And in New Zealand, in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in every English-speaking country, in fact, the same basic structure prevailed. The husband earned, the wife managed. The housekeeping was a weekly ritual. The bank account was in the husband's name. The financial decisions of the larger sort were made by the husband, with or without consultation, and the wife, no matter how competent, no matter how educated, no matter how essential to the household, was, in the formal sense, a dependent. But let us return now to our American scene. to the small suburban kitchen in the small American town where the young woman we have been following has finished her dinner, washed her dishes, and is now sitting in the living room with her husband and her children, watching the television set in the corner. The set is a small black and white model with a wooden cabinet, the kind that was beginning to appear in nearly every American home by the mid-1950s. The picture flickers slightly. The sound comes through a small mesh speaker on the front of the cabinet. The program is a family situation comedy, with a handsome father in a sweater and a pretty mother in a dress, and two cheerful children who get into mild and amusing scrapes. The family on the screen looks remarkably like the family in the living room, except more polished, more witty, more perfectly arranged. The young woman sits on the sofa beside her husband. The children sit on the floor in front of the set. The dog is on the rug by the fireplace. They watch the program together. They laugh at the small jokes. They follow the small storyline. And when the commercials come on between the segments of the show, the young woman watches with particular attention. Because the commercials are, in some sense, addressed directly to her. They are advertisements for the new dishwashing soap, for the new floor wax, for the new improved laundry detergent, for the new flavour of frozen vegetables. They are pitched at the housewife. They show her, in vivid colour and crisp sound, the products she should be using, the brands she should be loyal to, the standards of cleanliness and presentation she should be aspiring to, and she absorbs these messages, week by week, year by year, even when she does not consciously realise she is absorbing them. The television advertising of the 1950s was, in many ways, the first great American campaign aimed specifically at the housewife as a consumer. The advertisers had realised by the early post-war years that the woman in the home held the household purse strings, even if the husband technically owned the household money. The woman made the purchasing decisions about food, about cleaning products, about clothing for the children, about appliances, about furniture, about the 1,000 small items that filled the new suburban houses. And so the advertising of the 1950s was, in vast quantities, aimed at her. It told her what to buy. It told her how to be a good wife. It told her how to be a good mother. It told her how to keep a clean house and make a delicious meal and present herself attractively to her husband when he came home from work. And the housewife, by and large, listened. She watched the commercials, she read the magazines, she studied the advice columns, she tried the new products, she bought the new cleaners and the new convenience foods and the new improved appliances when she could afford them. And in this small daily participation in the consumer economy, in this small daily act of choosing this brand over that brand, this product over that one, she exercised, perhaps for the first time in her life, a kind of small economic agency. She was not earning the money, she was not, in the formal sense, controlling the money, but she was, in her daily choices at the grocery store and the drugstore and the department store, deciding where a significant portion of the household budget would go. She was the consumer, and the advertisers knew it, and they courted her, week after week, with all the persuasive power of the new mass media. This was a strange and ambiguous form of power. It was real, in some sense. The housewife of the 1950s wielded enormous collective influence over the American economy, through her purchasing decisions, through her brand loyalties, through her willingness to try new products and recommend them to her friends. The American consumer economy of the 1950s was, in significant measure, a housewife economy. The advertisers and the manufacturers and the retailers all knew this. They built their businesses around her. They depended on her. They flattered her. They competed for her attention and her dollars. And yet this power was strangely limited. The housewife did not own the dollars she was spending. She did not earn them. She did not, in the deepest sense, control them. She had been given them in small weekly increments by her husband, who had earned them at his job in the larger economy. And so her economic agency, however real in the daily choices it expressed, rested on a foundation of dependence. It was, in some sense, a borrowed power, and the borrowing of it was renewed every Friday, when the new envelope of housekeeping came home in her husband's pocket. Still, in the small moment of choosing one brand of soap over another, in the small moment of selecting one box of cereal over another, in the small moment of bringing home a new can of peas to try on Tuesday night's dinner, the housewife was exercising a real, if circumscribed, form of decision-making. She was making choices. She was expressing preferences. She was, in her small and private way, participating in the great churning machinery of American post-war prosperity. And this participation, however limited, was a kind of agency that her grandmother and her great-grandmother had not, in most cases, possessed. The supermarket was, in some sense, her domain. The cleaning products were her tools, the dinner table was her stage, and on that stage, in that domain, with those tools, she performed her work, day in and day out, with a competence and a dedication that no one else, in the larger world, quite recognized. The television program ends, the credits roll. The young woman gets up from the sofa to refill her husband's coffee cup. She walks into the kitchen, which is dark now except for the small lamp over the stove. She lights the gas under the kettle. She measures out the coffee, fresh ground, from the can in the cupboard. She returns to the living room with 2 fresh cups. She sets her husband's on the small side table beside his chair. She sits down again on the sofa with her own cup in her hands. The next program begins, a different family situation comedy, with a different perfect family in a different perfect house. They watch, they laugh, they sip their coffee, the evening passes. Around 9 o'clock, the children are sent up to bed. The young woman accompanies them, helps them brush their teeth, listens to their prayers, tucks them in under their cotton blankets, kisses their foreheads, turns out the small lamp on the bedside table. She returns downstairs. She joins her husband in the living room. They watch another program. They sit close, perhaps. He reaches for her hand, perhaps. They are tired. They are content. They are, in this small and ordinary moment, exactly where they had hoped, when they were young and newly engaged, that they would one day be. Around 10:30, the husband turns off the television. He stretches. He yawns. He says, "Time for bed." She agrees. She gets up. She takes the empty coffee cups to the kitchen. She rinses them in the sink and sets them in the drainer. She checks the back door to make sure it is locked. She turns off the kitchen light. She walks back through the dark living room, through the small hallway, up the small staircase, into the bedroom that she shares with her husband. He's already there, in his pajamas, brushing his teeth at the small sink in the corner. She undresses slowly behind the half-open closet door. She puts on her own nightgown. She takes down her hair. She removes the small bits of makeup she had applied that morning. She gets into bed. He gets into bed beside her. He turns off the lamp on the bedside table. The room goes dark. This is the end of the day. This is the long, quiet moment at the bottom of the great daily wave, where the work is done and the children are sleeping, and the house is silent and the world is, briefly, at rest. The young woman lies in the dark beside her husband. She listens to his breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep. She thinks briefly about tomorrow, the laundry that needs to be done, the shopping that needs to be planned, the small repair that the kitchen faucet needs, the letter she should write to her mother, the dress she should iron for Sunday. The list is long. The list is always long. But for now, she lets the list go. She closes her eyes. She lets her body sink into the soft mattress. She lets her mind drift. And somewhere in the drifting, in the soft, uncertain space between waking and sleeping, she thinks, briefly, of the money, of the small envelope on the kitchen counter with the few remaining dollars in it, of the careful counting she will do tomorrow morning, of the small private wish, never quite spoken even to herself, that someday the envelope might be hers, and the money in it might be hers, and the choices about what to do with it might be hers without needing anyone's permission, and without needing to ask anyone for anything at all. And then she sleeps, and the house sleeps, and the small suburban street sleeps, and the great gleaming country, in all its prosperity and all its imperfection, settles into the deep quiet of an American night in 1955. We have walked through one day. We have seen the small kitchens, the small budgets, the small careful arithmetic of the 1950s housekeeping system. We have seen the women who lived inside it. We have seen the husbands who participated in it, mostly without thinking about it. We have seen the children who grew up watching it. And we have seen the larger structures, the legal and economic and cultural structures, that held the whole arrangement in place. But this is only the beginning of the story. There is much more to tell. There are darker corners of this world and brighter ones too. There are the women who suffered under cruel or stingy husbands. There are the women who found small ways to assert their independence within the constraints of the system. There are the changes that began to come gradually through the late 1950s and into the early 1960s, as the world began to shift beneath the suburban houses with their picket fences and their gleaming kitchens. There are the women who would, in time, write the books and form the organisations and pass the laws that would, by the 1970s, transform the legal and economic position of married women in the English-speaking world. We will come to these things, slowly, as the night deepens, as the warmth of the blanket settles around you, as the small and gentle voice of the story continues, unhurried through the long and quiet hours. For now, let us rest. Let us let the young woman sleep. Let us let her husband sleep beside her. Let us let the children sleep in their small beds in the small rooms upstairs. Let us let the dog sleep on the rug by the fireplace. Let us let the whole house sleep, and the whole street, and the whole town, and the whole quiet country, while the moon climbs slowly over the maple trees and the stars wheel slowly through the deep, dark sky. The story continues. The night continues. The journey is long, and there is no hurry. Let us drift gently into the next part of this slow and patient unfolding. The morning comes again. The light moves slowly across the wallpaper of the bedroom. The alarm clock rings at 5:45. The young woman wakes. Her husband stirs beside her. The day begins again, exactly as it did yesterday, with the small, predictable rhythms of the household. The coffee, the breakfast, the lunches, the departure of the husband, the departure of the children, the vacuum cleaner, the laundry, the lists, the small, careful arithmetic of the dollars in the envelope. But let us not follow her through this day in the same close detail as we did the last. Let us, instead, lift our view a little. Let us think about the larger landscape of money and marriage in the 1950s. Let us think about the institutions that supported the housekeeping allowance system and the ones that challenged it, however quietly, and the small, slow changes that were beginning to accumulate beneath the surface of the apparently unchanging suburban world. Let us begin with the banks. The American bank of the 1950s was, for most married women, a building they entered only with their husbands, and a place where they had, in their own right, almost no standing. The bank teller would address the husband, even if the wife was the one doing most of the talking. The bank manager would refuse to open an account for a married woman without her husband's signature. The bank would refuse to issue a loan, a credit card, a mortgage, in the wife's name alone. The bank, in short, did not see the wife as an independent economic actor, and this was not, in the 1950s, controversial. It was simply how banking worked. A married woman who wanted to manage her own money therefore faced significant obstacles. If her husband was willing to add her name to a joint account, she could deposit and withdraw funds, write checks, and otherwise function within the family's financial life. But she could not, in most cases, open an account that was hers alone. And even when she had access to a joint account, her access depended on her husband's willingness to extend it. He could revoke her signing privileges at any time. He could empty the account without consulting her. He could open separate accounts she did not know about, where he could accumulate funds outside her view. The legal structure of married banking gave him essentially unlimited control over the family money, no matter what the daily practices of the marriage looked like. For a single woman, the situation was somewhat better. A single woman in 1955, especially if she had a job and a steady income, could open her own bank account in her own name, without anyone's permission. She could write her own checks. She could save her own money. She could, within certain limits, even apply for a loan. But the moment she married, all of this changed. The wedding ring, in financial terms, was a kind of legal transformation. The single woman who had managed her own money now became, in many practical respects, a financial appendage of her husband. This was, of course, a system that produced strange and sometimes painful situations. Women who had been working secretaries or school teachers or nurses, and who had been managing their own modest finances quite successfully for years, would marry and find themselves suddenly unable to open a checking account in their own name, unable to apply for a credit card on their own credit history, unable to make even small financial decisions without the involvement of a man they had known, in many cases, for only a few months. The transformation was abrupt. The transformation was, for many women, disconcerting, and yet, in the social atmosphere of the 1950s, the transformation was simply accepted as the normal and natural consequence of marriage. The first credit cards, by the way, were appearing in this same era. Diners Club had launched in 1950, American Express followed in 1958. The first general-purpose bank credit card, Bank AmeriCard, was introduced in California in 1958 as well. These early credit cards were issued almost exclusively to men. A married woman could be added to her husband's account as an authorized user, but the card was in his name, the credit history was his, and if the marriage ended, she would discover that all the years of careful spending and prompt payment had built up a credit record that belonged, legally and practically, to him alone. This particular injustice would become one of the central rallying points of the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. It would eventually be addressed by the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974 in the United States, which prohibited discrimination in lending on the basis of sex, race, and other factors. But in 1955, that law was nearly 20 years in the future, and in 1955, the credit system was simply structured around the assumption that men borrowed and women spent what men gave them. And this assumption shaped every aspect of how money moved through the family economy. There was also, of course, the issue of property. In the 1950s, the legal regime governing marital property varied considerably from state to state in the United States and from country to country across the English-speaking world. In some American states, particularly those with community property laws derived from Spanish and French civil law traditions, married couples were considered to own most of their assets jointly. In other states, with common law traditions inherited from England, the ownership of property within a marriage depended on who had legally acquired it. If the house was in the husband's name, it was his. If the car was in the husband's name, it was his. If the savings account was in the husband's name, it was his. And the wife, no matter how long she had been married, no matter how much unpaid labour she had contributed to the household, no matter how much of the husband's success she had supported through her work in the home, had no automatic legal claim to any of it. This meant, in practical terms, that if a marriage ended, whether by divorce or by death, the wife could find herself with very little. In a divorce, the courts might or might not award her a share of the family property, depending on the laws of the state and the inclinations of the judge. In the death of a husband, she would inherit, of course, but the inheritance would depend on the will, and the will might or might not leave her in a comfortable position. There were cases in which widowed women, who had been married for 30 or 40 years, who had raised 3 or 4 children, who had been the steady centre of the household for an entire lifetime, found themselves, after the husband's death, with almost no money and almost no property, while the bulk of the estate went to grown children or distant relatives or business partners. The unpaid labour of the homemaker, however essential, did not count in the legal sense as a contribution to the wealth of the marriage. This injustice, too, would be challenged in the decades to come. The Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act in the United Kingdom, passed in 1970, established for the first time that the work of the homemaker counted as a contribution to the marriage and that, in the event of divorce, the courts should consider the homemaker's contributions in dividing the marital property. Similar reforms came gradually to the United States, state by state, through the 1960s and 70s, with the rise of no-fault divorce and the recognition of equitable distribution principles. But in 1955, these reforms were still in the future. And the woman at the kitchen sink, washing the dinner dishes after another long day, had no legal recognition of the value of her work, no automatic right to any portion of the family wealth, no economic standing apart from her husband. It is worth pausing here to consider what this meant in practice for the daily life of the housewife. It meant that she could be loving and competent and entirely faithful to her marriage for decades, and still, at the end of it, have nothing in her own name. It meant that she lived, in some deep sense, on her husband's sufferance. It meant that her security depended entirely on his continued goodwill, his continued employment, his continued life. And while most marriages were, in fact, stable and most husbands were, in fact, decent providers, the structural vulnerability of the wife's position was always there, beneath the surface, however little she chose to think about it. And so the careful management of the housekeeping money took on, in many marriages, a quiet additional purpose. It was not just a matter of feeding the family this week, it was also a matter of building, in small and private and unrecorded ways, a small reserve, a small cushion, a small private fund that the wife could use in case something happened. The sugar tin in the back of the cupboard, the rolled-up bills in the old stocking, the small savings book kept in the bottom of the dresser drawer opened with the help of a sympathetic bank clerk at a branch on the other side of town, where the husband was unlikely to discover it. These private funds were, for many women, a quiet form of self-insurance. They were the small, secret way that the housewife protected herself against the structural vulnerability of her position. This was not, in the moralizing language of the time, considered admirable. The housewife who kept money back from her husband was, in the eyes of the magazines and the advice columns and the church sermons, doing something a little shady. She was being deceptive. She was being unwifely. She was failing to fully share with her husband, as a good wife should. And yet, in practice, vast numbers of women did exactly this. They kept their small private funds. They protected their small private interests. They did what they had to do within a system that did very little to protect them. The young woman in our story, by the way, has a small private fund. It is not very large. It amounts at the moment to about $18.75 in a small fabric pouch tucked behind a row of canned tomatoes on the top shelf of the pantry. She has been accumulating it slowly over the past 8 months, from small pennies and dimes and quarters that she has shaved off the grocery budget when she's been particularly clever. She has never told her husband about it. She's not sure she ever will. She's not sure she ever wants to. The small fund is hers. It is her tiny private kingdom of financial independence within the larger empire of the household economy. She does not at the moment have any specific plans for it. She has not decided what she will spend it on. She likes simply knowing that it is there. She likes the small private knowledge of her own small private wealth. And this, perhaps, is one of the deepest and most enduring features of the 1950s housewife's life. The small private interior world of independence and competence and quiet self-regard, maintained beneath the larger surface of household management and wifely duty. The housewife was, in her public face, the dutiful wife and the devoted mother. She was, in her interior, often something more complicated. She had her own thoughts, her own ambitions, her own small rebellions, her own carefully guarded territories of private agency. She did not, by and large, share these with anyone. They were her own. They were the small private space within which she remained, in some essential way, herself, no matter what the larger system asked of her. Let's think for a moment about the magazines. The women's magazines of the 1950s were, in many ways, the central cultural institution that shaped the housewife's understanding of her own life. There was Ladies' Home Journal, there was Good Housekeeping, there was McCall's, there was Better Homes and Gardens, there was Red Book. In Britain, there was Woman's Own and Woman's Weekly. These magazines arrived in the mailbox every week or every month, and they were eagerly devoured by millions of women who read them in their kitchens and their living rooms and their bedrooms, who clipped the recipes and saved the patterns and pondered the advice columns and absorbed, week by week, the great rolling presentation of what a good woman's life should look like. The magazines were, in many ways, the friendly older sister of the 1950s housewife. They offered her advice, encouragement, suggestions, recipes, fashion tips, decorating ideas, parenting strategies, and a continuous reassuring narrative of normal middle-class domestic life. They told her that her work mattered. They told her that her struggles were shared by other women. They told her that there were ways to do things better, easier, more efficiently, more attractively. They were, on balance, supportive and sympathetic and largely encouraging. But the magazines also enforced, in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, the norms of the housekeeping allowance system. They printed advice columns from women who were having trouble managing their housekeeping budgets, and the responses from the columnists invariably advised the women to be more frugal, more careful, more organized, rather than suggesting that the underlying arrangement might be unfair. They printed articles on how to ask your husband for money for a new dress, how to convince him to agree to a new piece of furniture, how to gently introduce the idea of a small holiday for the family. They printed cartoons in which the housewife was the lovable, slightly silly, slightly spendthrift figure, while the husband was the patient, slightly exasperated, ultimately indulgent provider. They printed, again and again, the visual and narrative templates of a marriage in which the man held the money and the woman managed it within the boundaries he set. And the housewife, reading these magazines, absorbed these templates. She saw her own life reflected in them. She saw her own struggles validated, but also, in some sense, accepted as normal and inevitable. The magazines did not, by and large, suggest that the system itself might be problematic. They suggested instead that the wise wife learned how to operate within it skillfully and gracefully. And so, the magazines, for all their support and sympathy, were also a powerful force for the reproduction of the very system that constrained the women who read them. There were exceptions, of course. There were articles here and there that hinted at deeper discontent. There were letters to advice columns that spoke in coded language of profound dissatisfaction. There were occasional pieces, especially toward the end of the 1950s, that began to acknowledge that the suburban housewife was, in many cases, lonely, frustrated, intellectually understimulated, and emotionally adrift. But these were, in 1955, still rare. The dominant narrative was one of cheerful domesticity, and the dominant advice was to find ways to be cheerful within it. The young woman in our story reads the magazines, of course. She reads Ladies' Home Journal in particular, because her mother-in-law gave her a subscription as a wedding gift, and she has continued it ever since. She reads the recipes, she tries the casseroles, she follows the advice on how to remove stains from cotton dresses, and how to fold fitted sheets, and how to organize the linen closet. She reads the advice columns with a mixture of recognition and quiet judgment. She reads the fiction, which is usually a small romance or a small domestic story with a happy ending. She reads the advertisements, which are bright and persuasive and full of new products to try, and she puts the magazine away at the end of the evening on the small table beside her bed, and she goes to sleep with images of perfect kitchens and perfect families and perfect lives swimming in her mind. This was the world she lived in. This was the world the housekeeping allowance system was embedded in. And this was the world that, slowly but inexorably, was about to begin to change. The changes did not come suddenly. They did not come because of any single event or any single book or any single political movement. They came, instead, from 1,000 small accumulating pressures, building over the late 1950s and into the 1960s, until at last they began to crack the surface of suburban domesticity and let through the first glimpses of a different possible world. One of these pressures was the rising educational level of American women. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, more and more women were graduating from high school, attending college, earning degrees. By 1960, women made up about 37% of all college students in the United States, a significant increase from earlier decades. And these educated women, when they married and entered the housekeeping allowance system, often found the transition difficult. They had been trained to think, to analyze, to read deeply, to write well. They had been told in their colleges that they were the equals of their male classmates, and then they had graduated, married, moved to the suburbs, and found themselves in a daily routine that asked nothing of their intellectual training and rewarded nothing of their independent judgment. This produced in many of these women a slow-growing sense of dissatisfaction. They could not exactly name what was wrong. They had everything that the culture told them they should want: a husband, a house, children, a kitchen, a station wagon, a country club membership perhaps. But there was a hollowness at the centre of it. There was a sense that the gifts they had been given did not quite use them, did not quite reach them, did not quite engage the full range of who they were. They felt, many of them, vaguely depressed. They felt many of them vaguely guilty about feeling depressed, because they were supposed to be grateful, and they were in fact often grateful, and yet the depression remained. This was the condition that Betty Friedan, in 1963, would name the problem that has no name. Her book, The Feminine Mystique, would describe in detail the experiences of educated suburban housewives in the late 1950s and early 1960s, women who'd been trained for one kind of life and were living another, women who had given up their professional ambitions for marriage and motherhood, and found themselves, in their 30s and 40s, asking quietly whether the trade had been worth it. The book would become a bestseller. It would help to ignite the second wave of American feminism, and it would put into words for the first time on such a wide scale the specific dissatisfactions of the post-war suburban housewife. But Friedan's book was still nearly a decade away in 1955, and the young woman in our story, washing her dishes after dinner, has not yet read it, has not yet heard of Friedan, has not yet articulated, even to herself, the specific shape of whatever might be missing from her life. She is, on this particular evening, simply tired. She's tired in the way she's tired every evening, after another long day of unbroken household work. She's grateful, in her way, for her family and her home. She's unsettled in her way, by something she cannot quite name, and she is, as she dries the dishes and puts them away in the cupboard, simply moving through her life one day at a time, one task at a time, one careful dollar at a time. Outside her window, The late evening sky is purple over the rooftops of the suburb. A single star is visible, low on the horizon. The street is quiet. The dogs of the neighbourhood are settling down for the night. The neighbours next door are turning out their lights, one room at a time. The whole little world of her suburban street is slowly preparing for sleep. She finishes the dishes, she wipes down the counter. She hangs the dish towel on its hook to dry. She turns off the kitchen light. She walks through the house, checking the doors, turning off the lamps, listening for the sounds of the children sleeping upstairs. Everything is in order. Everything is as it should be. The house is hers in some sense in its small daily operations. The house is her domain. The house is the great unwritten testimony of her work, her care, her competence. And she climbs the stairs slowly in her stockinged feet. She enters the bedroom. Her husband is already asleep, breathing slowly under the quilt. She undresses quietly. She puts on her nightgown. She slips into bed beside him. She closes her eyes. The night settles around her. The house settles around her. The small private fund in the pantry remains undiscovered behind the row of canned tomatoes. The grocery list for tomorrow waits, written on a small pad of paper on the kitchen counter. The dollars in the envelope wait, in their small folded stack, on the shelf in the cupboard above the stove. The whole apparatus of her life waits, patient and quiet, for the morning that will come and the day that will unfold, and the small careful work that she will do once again, as she has done every day for the past 6 years, as she will do every day for the next 30. She sleeps. The house sleeps. The street sleeps. The country sleeps. And the long quiet decade of the 1950s continues, slowly and inexorably, toward the changes that are coming, the changes that no one yet sees clearly, the changes that will, in time, transform the lives of women in ways that the young woman in our story cannot yet imagine. Let us drift gently into the next part of our story. The night is deep, the blankets are warm, the journey is long, there is no hurry. Let us go on slowly and softly into the small and quiet hours that lie ahead. Let us turn now to consider some specific aspects of the housekeeping system that we have not yet explored in depth. Let us think, for instance, about the very specific question of how much money a housewife in the 1950s actually received each week and what she had to do with it and how she made it stretch. The numbers varied widely, of course, depending on the family's income and location and circumstances. But let us consider some rough averages, drawn from the budgets that were published in the women's magazines and the family economics textbooks of the period. A young suburban housewife in the United States in 1955, married to a man earning the median family income of around $5,000 per year, might receive a weekly housekeeping allowance of somewhere between $20 and $30. Out of this sum, she would be expected to purchase all the family's food, all the small household supplies, all the children's day-to-day expenses, and perhaps her own small personal expenses as well, depending on the particular arrangement of the marriage. $20 to $30 a week in 1955 money is the equivalent of perhaps $200 to $300 a week in the money of today, give or take, depending on which inflation calculator one consults. It was not, on the face of it, a small sum. It was enough in 1955 to buy a reasonable amount of groceries and household necessities, but it had to cover a great deal. It had to cover not just the obvious items like meat and bread and milk, but also the small things that added up over the course of the week: the detergent for the laundry, the soap for the bathroom, the shampoo for the family, the polish for the floor, the cleanser for the bathtub, the wax paper, the aluminum foil, the packets of yeast for the baking, the salt and the sugar and the flour, the spices for the cooking, the matches for the gas stove, the light bulbs for the lamps, the pencils and the writing paper for the children's homework, the small repairs that came up, the school supplies, the Sunday school offerings, the small contributions to the church drive, the newspaper delivery, the hairpins and the bobby pins and the elastics for the daughter's braids, the shoe polish, the thread for the small mending, the button replacements, the handkerchiefs, the cotton balls, the aspirin. The list was endless. The list was unending. Every week brought new small expenses that had to be fit into the same fixed budget, and the housewife, week by week, had to make the calculations and the choices that would keep the household running smoothly within the constraints of the money she'd been given. This required, among other things, an enormous amount of unrecognized mental labor. The housewife had to remember the prices of dozens of items at multiple stores. She had to keep mental track of what was in the pantry and what was running low. She had to plan menus a week or two in advance, taking into account seasonal price variations and the limitations of her refrigeration. She had to anticipate small special expenses, like the cake she would need to bake for her daughter's birthday or the small gift she would need to give to her sister-in-law for her name day. She had to balance all of this against the constant pressure to keep the family eating well, looking respectable, and presenting an image of comfortable suburban prosperity to the neighbours and the relatives and the church congregation. And she had to do all of this without making her husband feel pressured or guilty about the limitations of the budget. She had to absorb the financial constraints into her own management, into her own creativity, into her own quiet ingenuity. The husband, in most marriages, did not want to be bothered with the details. He provided the money. The wife provided the meals and the clean shirts and the well-behaved children. The transaction was supposed to be smooth, invisible, automatic. And the housewife who could not or would not make it look easy was a housewife who had in some sense failed. This expectation of effortless competence was itself a kind of pressure. It meant that the housewife could not, in most marriages, openly discuss her financial worries with her husband. She could not say, "The budget is too tight, I cannot make this work, you need to give me more money." Such a statement would have been, in the cultural script of the time, an accusation. It would have been an implication that the husband was failing to provide adequately. It would have been a small insult to his manhood, his competence, his role as the breadwinner. And so most women, even when they were in fact struggling, did not say these things. They simply worked harder. They cut more corners. They went without small luxuries themselves so that the husband and the children would not have to. They became, in their carefully constructed presentations of household competence, performers of a kind of cheerful efficiency that masked considerable underlying strain. The young woman in our story is not on the whole struggling in this way. Her husband is reasonably generous, and his salary is comfortable, and the housekeeping budget, while always tight, is generally adequate to the family's needs. She does not have to skip meals or refuse to buy the children's school supplies or pretend to have eaten when she has not. She is, by any reasonable measure, doing fine. But she knows other women who are not doing fine. She knows, for instance, the woman who lives 2 streets over, in the small green house with the white trim, whose husband drinks too much and brings home only a fraction of his pay packet, and who has been seen more than once returning items to the supermarket because she could not afford them after all. She knows the woman across the street whose husband, in some private quarrel, has been giving her only $10 a week for the past 2 months and watching her struggle to make it work, in what seems to be a slow form of marital warfare. She knows the woman who lives at the end of the cul-de-sac, whose husband died suddenly of a heart attack last year, leaving her with 3 small children and almost no savings and a deep and bewildered uncertainty about what to do next. These women are her neighbours. These women are, in some sense, herself in other circumstances. These women remind her, without her quite consciously thinking about it, of the precariousness of her own position, of the structural vulnerability that lies just beneath the surface of her comfortable suburban life. She's fortunate. She is, for now, secure. But the same system that protects her, in the form of her good husband and his steady income, could just as easily fail her, in the form of a different husband or a different fate. And the line between her own comfortable life and her neighbours' more difficult ones is, in some sense, almost arbitrary. It is the line of a good marriage. It is the line of luck. This is perhaps why the women of the 1950s were so often supportive of each other, even when they were not particularly close. They knew at some level that they shared a common vulnerability. They knew that they were all, in some sense, in the same boat, with varying degrees of comfort and varying degrees of risk. And so they helped each other. They watched each other's children. They lent each other cups of sugar. They quietly slipped small gifts of food to the woman with the drunk husband. They organised small fundraisers for the widow. They did, in their small and informal ways, the work of mutual aid that the larger society did not, in the 1950s, do very well. The young woman in our story, for instance, has been saving small portions of her grocery money over the past several weeks to buy a small gift for the widow at the end of the cul-de-sac. She has not told her husband. She has simply decided on her own that she will take 25 cents from her grocery envelope each week, and at the end of 2 months she will have $2, and she will use that $2 to buy a small Christmas gift for the widow and her children. This is, in some sense, her own private charity. It is not the charity of the household, it is the charity of the housewife, performed quietly within the small interior space of her own management of the family money. And she is rather proud of it in her quiet way. It is, in some sense, her own contribution to the small, slow work of holding her community together. The hours pass, the afternoons in the 1950s suburbs stretch out, long and warm and slow in their slow, predictable rhythms. The houses are quiet, the lawns are green, the mailman walks his route, the milkman makes his deliveries, the children come home from school and play in the yards and the streets and the empty lots between the new developments. The mothers stand in their kitchens and on their porches and at their clotheslines, doing the slow work of the day. The fathers are at their offices, in their factories, on their sales routes, in their distant and largely invisible places of work. The world turns slowly through its slow days, and the small daily transactions of household money continue week after week, dollar after dollar, year after year. We are deep in the night now, the blankets are warm, the story has been going on for a long time, and there is still much more to tell. But let us pause here for a long quiet moment and let the story settle. Let us let the world of the 1950s grow quiet around us. Let us let the small kitchens and the small kitchens and the small careful budgets fade, briefly, into the soft background of our minds. Let us breathe, slowly and deeply. Let us feel the soft weight of the blankets. Let us feel the slow rhythm of our own hearts. Let us drift gently into the deep and quiet space of late-night listening, where the words become less important than the slow, steady music of the voice, where the meaning becomes less important than the feeling, where the historical details become less important than the warm sense of being held in a story that is unfolding slowly, patiently, without urgency, in a small and gentle voice that will continue for as long as we need it to continue, into the long, quiet hours that lie ahead. The story continues. The night continues. The journey is long and there is no hurry. Let us drift, slowly, into the next part of this slow and patient unfolding. We return now to that small American kitchen in 1955 on a quiet afternoon in midsummer. The young woman is at the kitchen table. She has poured herself a small glass of iced tea from the pitcher in the icebox. There is a slice of lemon floating in it. There is a small sprig of mint from the herb pot on the windowsill. She's sitting briefly in the small wooden chair by the back door. The afternoon sun is slanting through the screen. The garden is full of bees and butterflies. The laundry is drying on the line. She has on the table before her a small ledger book. It is a simple book, perhaps 4 inches by 6 inches, with a green cloth cover and ruled paper inside. She uses it to keep her household accounts. She opens it. She picks up the small pencil that she keeps with it. She begins to enter the expenses of the past week. Groceries, $12.38. Milk delivery, 90 cents. Newspaper delivery, 20 cents. Bread delivery, 85 cents. Children's school lunches paid in advance, $1.25 for the week. Sunday school offering, 20 cents. Church collection, 50 cents. Stamps for the letters to her mother and her aunt, 6 cents. Aspirin for the family medicine cabinet, 15 cents. Small thread for mending her husband's shirt, 10 cents. A new pair of stockings to replace a pair that snagged on a kitchen drawer, 50 cents. A small bag of penny candy for the children who had been particularly good all week, 20 cents. The total comes to $17.29. She has spent $17.29 this week. She had been given, on Friday evening, an envelope containing $20. There are therefore $2.71 remaining in the envelope. Of this, she has saved secretly 25 cents for the widow's Christmas gift. So the actual remaining funds for the rest of the week are $2.46. This will need to cover the small additional purchases that may arise between now and Friday evening, when the new envelope will be given. She does the calculations carefully. Bread, probably another 15 cents. Milk, probably another 60 cents. A small bag of flour, because the current bag is nearly empty, 30 cents. Perhaps a small piece of cheese for her husband's lunches, 30 cents. Perhaps a small treat, if the budget allows for Saturday afternoon, a small pint of ice cream, 20 cents. The total comes to $1.55. She would, therefore, have 91 cents left over, which she could, if she wished, slide into her small private fund. She closes the ledger book. She replaces the pencil in the small jar on the table. She takes a slow sip of her iced tea. She looks out at the garden. The bees are working in the small bed of marigolds that she planted in the spring. A butterfly, white and yellow, drifts past the screen door. The laundry sways gently in the warm afternoon breeze. The world is, in this small moment, peaceful and full of small, ordinary beauty. She thinks idly about the money, about the careful columns of figures in her green ledger book, about the small private fund in the pantry, which now has $18.75 in it, and might have $18.99 in it by the end of the week, about what she might do with this money, eventually. She has been thinking lately that she might like to save it up until she has enough to buy a small second-hand bicycle. There is a women's bicycle, an old pre-war Schwinn in faded blue paint, that has been sitting in the window of the second-hand shop on Elm Street for several weeks. The shop owner is asking $8 for it. She has thought more than once that she would like to have it. She has thought that she could ride it in the afternoons while the children were at school to the small library on the other side of town. She has thought that she could ride it to the small park by the river on Saturday mornings, with the children running alongside in their summer clothes. She has thought that she could ride it, perhaps, all the way out to the country lanes beyond the edge of the suburb, where the cornfield stretched out under the wide blue sky, and where she could be, for an hour or two, simply herself, simply a woman on a bicycle in the wind, with no one asking anything of her and nothing to do except keep pedaling. But she has not yet bought the bicycle. She has not yet told her husband about the idea. She is not entirely sure how he would react. He might think it was charming. He might think it was a waste of money. He might think that women her age, with 2 small children and a household to run, should not be riding bicycles around town like schoolgirls. She is not yet ready to find out. And so the bicycle remains in the window of the second-hand shop, and the small private fund grows slowly in the pantry, and the question of what she will do with it remains, for now, undecided. She finishes her iced tea. She rises from the small wooden chair. She rinses the glass at the sink. She picks up her broom and her dustpan. She begins slowly to sweep the kitchen floor. The afternoon continues. The work of the household continues. The small private dreams of bicycles and country lanes are folded gently into the deep pockets of the day. This was, in some sense, the texture of the 1950s housewife's interior life. The small private dreams, the small private funds, the small private acts of imagination that she allowed herself in the quiet hours of the afternoon, while the laundry dried on the line and the children were still at school and the husband was still at the office and the house was hers briefly, in a way that it was not at any other time of the day. These small private moments were, in some sense, the spaces in which she remained herself. They were the small kingdoms of her own interior life, and she protected them, often without quite realizing she was protecting them, against the larger demands of the household and the marriage and the suburban world. The afternoon passes, the light shifts. The children come home from school banging through the back door with their stories and their hunger and their small tribulations. She gives them their afternoon snack. She listens to their accounts of the day. She helps the older one with a small arithmetic problem. She kisses the younger one's scraped knee. She sends them out to play in the yard until dinner. She begins then the preparations for the evening meal. Tonight is Wednesday. Wednesday is casserole night. She has planned this week a tuna casserole made with the small can of tuna she purchased on Monday, the box of noodles from the cupboard, the can of cream of mushroom soup from the shelf, the small package of frozen peas from the small freezer compartment of the refrigerator, and a topping of crushed potato chips from the bag she has been saving for this purpose. It is a quick and easy dish, much loved by her children, and much loved also by her husband, who has eaten it every Wednesday for the past 6 years, and shows no signs of growing tired of it. The casserole is a small and humble dish, but it is, in some sense, a small symbol of her competence as a housekeeper. It is filling, it is reliable, it is inexpensive, and it allows her to spend more of the housekeeping budget on the better meals of Friday and Saturday and Sunday when company often comes and the standards are higher. She prepares the casserole, she drains the noodles, she mixes them with the tuna and the soup and the peas. She turns the mixture into a glass baking dish. She tops it with the crushed potato chips. She slides it into the oven. She sets the timer. She begins to set the table. She moves through the small ritual of dinner preparation with the easy, unconscious grace of a woman who has done it 10,000 times. The husband comes home at 6:15. The family sits down to dinner at 6:30. The casserole is good. The children are pleased. The husband compliments her on the meal. They eat, they talk, they share the small ordinary news of the day. The dog sits beside the table. The radio plays softly in the background. The summer evening, with its long golden light and its soft warm breeze, settles around the house. After dinner, the husband helps her clear the dishes. This is unusual. Most evenings he simply retires to the living room while she handles the kitchen on her own. But tonight, for some reason, he stays. He carries the plates to the sink. He scrapes them into the small bucket she keeps for kitchen scraps. He stands beside her at the sink and dries the dishes as she washes them. They work in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then he says casually, I was thinking it might be nice to take the family on a small holiday this summer, just for a week, up to the lake perhaps. We could rent a small cabin. The children would love it. She turns to look at him. He's smiling slightly in a way that is both shy and pleased. He has been thinking about this, she realizes. He has been carrying this idea around with him for some time. He's been waiting for the right moment to bring it up. She says, that would be wonderful, I would love to, but can we afford it? He nods. He says, I think we can. I have been putting a little extra aside from the bonus I got last quarter. There should be enough for the cabin rental and the gasoline and a little extra for treats and ice cream and small meals out. The children have never been to a real lake. I think they would remember it forever. She feels, in that moment, a warm and complicated wave of feeling. There is love, certainly. There is gratitude for her husband, who has been quietly planning this small surprise. There is excitement at the prospect of a small holiday away from the routine of the house. But there is also, somewhere underneath, the small old familiar feeling of being on the receiving end of a financial decision that has been made by someone else. Her husband has been putting money aside. Her husband has been planning. Her husband has decided that they can afford this. And she, who manages every dollar of the household budget with such careful precision, has known nothing about it until this moment. She does not say this, of course. She does not even fully articulate it to herself. The feeling passes quickly, overwhelmed by the larger warm flood of gratitude and anticipation. She smiles. She says, "Oh, the children will be so happy. When did you have in mind?" He says, "The last week of July, perhaps. I've already spoken to my supervisor about the time off. We can leave on a Saturday morning and come back the following Saturday afternoon. That will give us a full week." She nods. She smiles. She finishes the dishes. They talk for the rest of the evening about the plans for the trip, about what they will pack, about what the children should know, about the small details of the cabin and the lake and the small town nearby where they will buy their groceries for the week. That night, in bed, after her husband has fallen asleep, she lies awake for a while, thinking about the trip. She is, she realizes, genuinely happy. The trip is a wonderful idea. It will be a beautiful break for all of them. The children will love it. She herself will love it. The small holiday will be in many ways one of the high points of the year, and her husband, who is a good man, who works hard, who provides for his family, has thought of it and arranged it and presented it to her as a gift. She loves him for this. She is, in this moment, deeply grateful for him. But there is still, somewhere in the back of her mind, the small ghost of a different feeling. The feeling of having been given something rather than having decided something. The feeling of being a recipient rather than a participant. The feeling that, even in the small private moments of family pleasure, the agency and the planning and the financial control belong in some essential way to her husband, and she is, again, on the receiving end of his decisions. She does not, even now, name this feeling clearly. She does not, even now, allow it to disturb her gratitude. She simply notices it, in the small, quiet way she has come to notice such things, and then she lets it go. She rolls onto her side. She closes her eyes. She thinks about the lake, about the small cabin, about the children's faces when they hear the news in the morning. She thinks about the small holiday, and the small joy it will bring, and the small additional weeks of summer that lie ahead, and slowly, gently, she drifts off into sleep. Outside, the suburban night is dark and quiet. The stars are wheeling slowly through the sky. The crickets are singing in the long grass. The dogs are sleeping on their rugs. The whole great gleaming country, in all its prosperity and all its imperfection, is settling into the deep dark hours before dawn. And in millions of small bedrooms, in millions of small houses, in millions of small lives, the women of 1955 are sleeping beside the men they have married, with their small private funds tucked away in their pantries and their small private dreams folded into the corners of their hearts. The story continues, the night continues, the journey is long and there is no hurry. Let us drift, slowly and softly, into the next part of this long and quiet unfolding. We have spent a long time in one suburban kitchen, with one young woman and her one quiet life. Let us now lift our gaze and look more broadly at the patterns of the housekeeping system across the wider world of the 1950s. Let us think about how this system was in fact beginning to crack and shift, in ways that the young woman in our kitchen could not yet see, but that were already at work, in laboratories and universities and government offices and small private kitchens and bedrooms and meeting rooms, all across the English-speaking world. The first cracks were appearing in some sense in the labour market itself. The percentage of married women in the American workforce had been rising steadily throughout the 1950s, even as the dominant cultural narrative continued to celebrate the full-time housewife. By 1960, about 30% of married American women were employed outside the home in some capacity, up from about 20% in 1950. These were, in many cases, part-time jobs. They were jobs as secretaries, as school teachers, as nurses, as sales clerks, as waitresses, as factory workers. They were jobs that fit around the demands of household and motherhood. But they were jobs that brought in money, that placed money in the woman's own hands, that gave her, however modestly, some independent economic standing. The growth of married women's employment was driven by several factors. Many families found, as the consumer expectations of the post-war era rose, that one income was no longer quite enough. The cost of a house, of a car, of the children's college tuition, of all the new appliances and gadgets that the advertising encouraged them to want, exceeded what the husband alone could provide. The wife went to work, often part-time, to help close the gap, and in doing so she introduced into the household economy a small but significant new variable. The earnings of the working wife went, in many marriages, directly into the family pot, where they were managed by the same housekeeping arrangements as before. But in some marriages, particularly as the 1950s wore on, the wife began to keep her own paycheck. She paid for her own clothes from it. She paid for the children's school clothes from it. She bought herself small luxuries, magazines, lipsticks, occasional nights out with friends from it. She did not, in most cases, openly challenge her husband's control of the larger family money. But she carved out, with her own paycheck, a small independent territory of financial agency that her stay-at-home counterparts did not possess. This was in many ways the slow beginning of the end of the housekeeping allowance system. As more women earned their own money, the very logic of the system began to weaken. If a wife had her own paycheck, however small, the question of why she should have to ask her husband for permission to buy a dress, or a hat, or a hairpin became increasingly difficult to answer. The old system had rested on the assumption that all the money in the household came from the husband. As that assumption became less and less true, the system itself began to lose its grip. But the change was slow. It was gradual. It happened over years and decades, not weeks or months. And in 1955, the young woman in our kitchen was still, like the majority of married American women, not working outside the home. Her economic life was still entirely shaped by the housekeeping envelope and the small, careful arithmetic of the dollars within it. The changes were coming, but they had not yet, for her, arrived. There were also, in the 1950s, the first stirrings of what would become the legal reform of marital property and credit. Small organizations of women lawyers and reformers were beginning to gather information, write articles, organize meetings, draft model legislation. They were not yet, in the mid-1950s, anything like a mass movement. They were small, scattered, often dismissed. But they were there. They were thinking. They were writing. They were laying the intellectual groundwork for the reforms that would come in many countries in the late 1960s and the 1970s. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act in the United States, passed in 1974, did not come from nowhere. It came from years of organizing, of testimony before congressional committees, of careful documentation of the discriminations that women faced in the credit market. The Sex Discrimination Act in Britain, passed in 1975, came from years of similar work by British activists and legal reformers. The Married Women's Property Act amendments in various American states, the no-fault divorce reforms, the equitable distribution principles that came to govern divorce courts, all of these came from work that was, in many cases, already underway in the 1950s, even if it had not yet reached the public eye. And so the world of 1955 was, in some sense, a world poised on the edge of change, even though it did not yet quite know it. The young woman in our kitchen was, in some sense, living in the last days of the old order, even though the old order seemed, to her and to most of her contemporaries, as permanent and immovable as the maple trees that lined her suburban street. The new order, in which she would eventually have her own bank account, her own credit card, her own paycheck, her own legal claim to the family property, was coming. It was coming slowly. It was coming through small accumulating changes that no single person, in 1955, could quite see in their full pattern, but it was coming. She did not know it. She could not have known it. She simply lived her life, one careful day at a time, in the world she'd inherited, in the world she had been shaped by, in the world she would, in time, pass on to her daughters in altered form. Her daughters. Let us think for a moment about the daughters of the 1950s housewife. The young woman in our kitchen has only sons in this particular telling, but many of her neighbours have daughters, small girls in pink dresses and patent leather shoes, who are growing up in the suburbs of the 1950s, who are watching their mothers manage the housekeeping budget and ask for grocery money and absorb the small daily lessons of female economic dependency, and who will, in 20 years, in their 20s and 30s, become the women who march for the Equal Rights Amendment, and the women who burn their bras at the Miss America pageant in 1968, and the women who flood into the law schools and medical schools and business schools of the 1970s, and the women who, finally, in vast numbers, simply refuse to accept the housekeeping allowance system as the natural order of things. These daughters of the 1950s housewife were watching, even when they did not know they were watching. They were absorbing, even when they did not know they were absorbing. They were noticing in the small private way of children the small daily indignities that their mothers absorbed without complaint. They were noticing the silent transactions of the housekeeping envelope. They were noticing the way their mothers had to ask. They were noticing the way their fathers held the money and made the decisions and dispensed the small permissions. And they were thinking, in the small private way of children, that this was the way the world was, but also perhaps that this was not the way they themselves wanted to live when they grew up. This is one of the great unintended consequences of the housekeeping allowance system. It produced, in the daughters of the women who lived under it, a deep and lasting determination to live differently. It produced women who would, in their adult lives, fight for their own paychecks, their own bank accounts, their own credit cards, their own property. It produced women who would, in their adult lives, find the cultural script of dependent housewifery intolerable, even as their mothers had found it merely difficult or tedious. It produced, in short, the second wave of American feminism and its counterparts around the English-speaking world. But this is, again, getting ahead of our story. In 1955, the daughters are still small, the mothers are still managing the housekeeping, the system is still in place, and the slow accumulation of pressures that will, in 15 or 20 years, transform everything, is still happening quietly beneath the surface in the small lives of millions of women. Let us return, one more time, to the small suburban kitchen. The young woman is finishing the evening's work. The children are in bed. The husband is in the living room reading the newspaper. The house is quiet. The clock on the wall ticks slowly. The refrigerator hums. The dog snores softly on the rug. She walks to the small cupboard above the stove. She opens it. She takes down the small envelope of housekeeping money. She opens it and counts the bills. She counts the coins in her coin purse. She enters the figures into her green ledger book. She balances the week's accounts. There are $2.46 remaining, as she had calculated. There are $18.75 in the small fabric pouch in the pantry, behind the row of canned tomatoes. Everything is in order. Everything is accounted for. The careful machinery of her household economy is, for one more week, running smoothly. She closes the ledger book. She replaces it in the small drawer beneath the kitchen table. She puts the envelope of housekeeping money back into the cupboard. She closes the cupboard door. She turns off the kitchen light. She walks through the dark house, checking the doors, listening for the sounds of the children sleeping. Everything is well. Everything is at peace. She climbs the stairs. She enters the bedroom. Her husband has come up before her and is already in bed reading. He looks up and smiles. She smiles back. She undresses behind the half-open closet door. She puts on her nightgown. She brushes her hair at the small dressing table. She removes her makeup. She gets into bed beside her husband. He puts down his book. He turns off the bedside lamp. He kisses her briefly on the temple. He rolls over. He sleeps. She lies awake for a few minutes, listening to his breathing slow. She thinks briefly about the day, the grocery shopping, the careful counting of dollars, the casserole, the small surprise of the holiday plan, the slow, steady accumulation of small, ordinary moments that make up a life. She thinks about her small private fund. She thinks about the bicycle in the window of the second-hand shop. She thinks about the country lanes beyond the edge of the suburb, the cornfields under the wide blue sky. And then she sleeps, and the house sleeps, and the great gleaming country, in all its prosperity and all its imperfection, settles once again into the deep, dark hours before dawn. The night is very deep now. The blankets are warm. The story has been long, and there is perhaps only a little more to tell. Let us continue, gently, into the final quiet stretch of our long journey through this small and ordinary and extraordinary world. Let us think now, in this gentle final stretch, about what the housekeeping allowance system meant in the larger scheme of things. Let us think about how it shaped not only the daily lives of the women who lived within it, but the larger contours of American and British and Western post-war society. The system shaped the geography of the suburbs. It shaped the architecture of the houses. It shaped the design of the kitchens. It shaped the products that filled the supermarkets. It shaped the advertisements that filled the magazines. It shaped, in countless small ways, the texture of mid-century life. The whole great machinery of post-war consumer society was, in some sense, built on the assumption of the dependent housewife and the male breadwinner. The whole great suburban project was, in some sense, designed around the small daily rituals of the housekeeping envelope and the supermarket shopping cart. And when this system began to change in the 1960s and 70s, the whole great machinery began to change as well. The suburbs began to feel different. The kitchens began to be designed differently. The supermarkets began to stock different products. The magazines began to print different articles. The advertisements began to address different audiences. The whole great architecture of mid-century domesticity began, slowly and unevenly, to be remodelled into something new. Some of these changes were good. The women who, by 1980, could open their own bank accounts and apply for their own credit cards and own their own homes were freer, in important ways, than their mothers had been. They could leave bad marriages. They could support themselves. They could make their own financial decisions. They could build their own economic lives. These were real gains. These were the fruits of the long, slow work of the women's movement and the legal reforms it produced. But some of the changes brought their own complications. The dual-income family, which became the norm in the United States by the 1990s, brought new pressures of time and exhaustion that the single-income family of the 1950s had not faced. The career woman of the 1980s, who was expected to succeed at her job and her motherhood and her marriage all at once, found that she had, in some sense, simply added a new layer of work to the old layer, rather than replacing the old layer. The housekeeping allowance was gone, but the housekeeping itself remained, and it was now expected to be done in the hours not devoted to paid employment, which were, of course, many fewer than the hours that had been available when the wife stayed home full-time. These are not the topics for tonight's story. They are stories for other nights. But it is worth noting, as we draw this evening's tale to a close, that the changes that came after the 1950s brought their own challenges, their own losses, their own new forms of difficulty. The young woman in our kitchen in 1955 would have been, in many ways, freer than her granddaughter would be in 2025, just as her granddaughter would be, in many ways, freer than she was. Each generation traded one set of constraints for another. Each generation gained certain freedoms and lost certain others. The arc of history is, perhaps, not so much a steady climb toward perfect liberation as it is a long, slow rotation through different shapes of human life, each with its own grace and its own grief. The young woman in our kitchen did not know any of this, of course. She knew only her own life, her own time, her own world. She knew the small kitchen, the small budget, the small careful arithmetic of the dollars in the envelope. She knew the small daily acts of cooking and cleaning and tending to the people she loved. She knew the warm summer afternoons and the cold winter mornings and the slow turning of the seasons through the small suburban world she inhabited. She knew her husband, whom she loved. She knew her children, whom she adored. She knew her small private fund in the pantry, which was hers and hers alone. She knew the small private dream of the bicycle in the window of the second-hand shop. She knew, in some deep and unspoken way, both the limits of her life and the small and quiet beauties within it. And she lived. Day after day, week after week, year after year, she lived. She raised her children to be good people, kind and honest and capable. She kept her house clean, and her meals nourishing, and her marriage steady. She managed her budget with the care of a small accountant and the creativity of a small artist. She accumulated over the years a small private fund that grew, slowly, into a few $100s. She did eventually buy the bicycle in the window of the second-hand shop, and she did sometimes ride it down to the river on Saturday mornings, and she did sometimes ride it out to the country lanes beyond the edge of the suburb, where the cornfields stretched out under the wide blue sky, and she could be, for an hour or two, simply herself, simply a woman on a bicycle in the wind. She did not have an extraordinary life. She had an ordinary life. She was one of millions of women like her, who lived through the long, quiet decade of the 1950s and into the 1960s and beyond, who raised their children and kept their houses and managed their budgets and absorbed, in their quiet way, the slow turning of the world around them. They were not famous. They were not by and large written about in the history books. They were the great quiet underpinning of the post-war age, the women who made the meals and folded the laundry and walked to the supermarket with their carefully counted dollars, and kept the small houses warm, and the small children fed, and the small streets quiet, and the small country running. And they deserve perhaps to be remembered. They deserve to be honoured. They deserve to be seen, not as victims of a system, though the system did indeed limit them in real ways, and not as the saccharine, cheerful housewives of the television commercials, though some of them did indeed find joy in their work, but as real women, complicated women, women with private dreams and private griefs, and private moments of beauty and small private kingdoms of independence within the larger structures of dependence. They were people. They were full human beings. They were, in the deepest and most important sense, the equals of the men they married, even when the laws and the customs and the banks and the magazines did not yet recognize them as such. Tonight, we have spent the long hours together in their world. We have walked through their kitchens and watched them count their dollars. We have seen their small private funds and their small private dreams. We have followed them through their long days of work and their short evenings of rest. We have seen the system that constrained them and the small ways they navigated within it. We have seen, perhaps, a little more clearly, what it meant to be a married woman in the middle of the 20th century, in the small towns and small suburbs of the great gleaming post-war world. The story is ending now. The night is deep. The blankets are warm. The young woman in our kitchen is sleeping, in her small bedroom in her small house, beside her husband whom she loves. The small envelope of housekeeping money waits, in the cupboard above the stove, for the morning to come and the day to begin again. The small private fund waits, in the small fabric pouch behind the row of canned tomatoes in the pantry. The small grocery list waits, written in pencil on the back of an envelope, on the kitchen counter. The small ledger book waits, in the drawer beneath the kitchen table, with its careful columns of figures balanced to the penny. Everything is in order, everything is at rest. The house is quiet, the street is quiet, the town is quiet. The great gleaming country, in all its prosperity and all its imperfection, is settling into the deep dark hours before dawn. Tomorrow the young woman will rise at 5:45, the alarm clock will ring, the coffee will percolate, the eggs will fry in butter, the husband will read the newspaper, the children will tumble down the stairs in their school clothes. The day will begin again, in its slow, predictable rhythm, with its small, careful arithmetic of dollars and pennies and shillings, and the slow, steady work of feeding the people she loves with the money she's been given. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, she sleeps, and tonight, we let her sleep. And tonight, we let the long, quiet decade of the 1950s fade gently into the soft background of our minds. and tonight we let ourselves drift, slowly and softly, into the deep, warm rest that lies beneath all the small, careful work of waking life. Let us, before we let the story fully settle, drift through a few more rooms in this long, quiet house of memory. Let us look at some of the corners we have not yet visited, some of the small particular textures of the housekeeping system that remain to be gently unfolded in our minds before sleep comes fully. Let us think, for instance, about the holidays. The great cycle of holidays that marked the year in the 1950s suburban household placed particular pressures on the housekeeping budget, pressures that the housewife had to absorb and manage and somehow accommodate within the same small weekly envelope. There was Thanksgiving, with its turkey and its stuffing and its sweet potatoes and its pumpkin pies. There was Christmas, with its presents and its decorations and its great roasted goose or ham and its endless extended family meals. There was Easter, with its ham and its scalloped potatoes and its small bright candies for the children's baskets. There was the 4th of July, with its picnic foods and its small fireworks for the backyard. There was Halloween, with its candy for the trick or treaters and its small costumes for the children. There were the birthdays, one for each member of the family, each requiring a small special meal and a cake and a small gift. Each of these holidays meant extra expense. Each of them meant the housewife had to find, somewhere in her budget, the additional dollars for the special foods and the small gifts and the decorations and the extra mileage on the family car to visit relatives. And in most households there was no separate holiday budget. There was no special envelope for Christmas. There was only the same weekly housekeeping money, which had to stretch somehow to cover the holidays as well as the ordinary weeks of the year. The skilled housewife planned for this. She began, in October, to save small portions of her weekly money toward the Christmas expenses that would come. She bought small gifts gradually throughout the autumn, so that by the time December arrived she would not be caught with empty cupboards and an empty purse. She baked her own Christmas cookies, dozens of them, in big batches, using flour and butter and sugar bought in bulk when the supermarket had a sale. She made her own Christmas decorations, often with the help of the children, from construction paper and pine cones and bits of ribbon saved from earlier years. She wrapped her gifts in last year's wrapping paper, smoothed and folded carefully, or in plain brown paper decorated with small homemade designs. She made everything stretch. She made everything count. And the children, growing up in this environment, learned, often without quite realizing they were learning, that the great holidays of the year were the product of their mother's careful planning and her quiet daily ingenuity. They did not know how much she had saved, or for how long, or what small private sacrifices she had made along the way. They knew only that the Christmas tree appeared in the living room on the morning of December 20th, and the stockings were full on Christmas morning, and the great meal was on the table at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the gifts were beneath the tree neatly wrapped, with their names written on the tags in their mother's careful handwriting. They knew only the magic of the holiday. They did not know yet the labour that had produced the magic. This is perhaps one of the deepest paradoxes of the 1950s housewife's life. She produced for her family an experience of comfort and abundance and stability that depended in large part on the invisibility of her own labour. The smoother the household ran, the less visible was her work. The more delicious the meals, the less obvious was the careful budgeting that had produced them. The more cheerful the holidays, the less her family thought about the months of small saving that had made them possible. Her competence was, in some sense, her own erasure. The better she did her job, the less anyone noticed she had done it. And this had a strange effect on the relationship between mothers and children, between wives and husbands in the 1950s household. The children took their mother for granted. The husband took his wife for granted. The smooth running of the household was simply assumed to be the natural state of things, the way things ought to be, the way things would always be. And when, in the 1960s and 70s, many of these wives began to assert themselves, began to demand recognition for their work, began to speak openly about the dissatisfactions of their lives, many of their husbands and children reacted with surprise and confusion, and sometimes anger. They had not seen the labour, they had not understood the cost. They had not realized that the smooth surface of family life had been produced at great expense by a woman whose effort had been so consistently rendered invisible that even she, in many cases, had stopped seeing it clearly. Let us think too about the small daily emergencies that the housewife had to manage within her limited budget. A child broke a window with a baseball, a pipe leaked in the bathroom, the icebox stopped working, the car needed a new tyre, the dog needed a visit to the veterinarian. The husband's good shoes needed to be resoled. The roof developed a small leak. Any one of these events would require additional money beyond the regular housekeeping budget, and the question of where that money would come from was a question that the housewife had to navigate carefully, often diplomatically, sometimes with a small private sense of dread. The skilled housewife, again, planned for these emergencies as best she could. She kept a small contingency fund, separate from her private fund, made up of small portions of the housekeeping money that she'd managed to set aside for unforeseen expenses. She knew which repairs could be done by the husband on a Saturday morning, with a few tools from the garage, and which would require calling in a professional. She knew which problems could be put off for a week or two, and which had to be addressed immediately. She managed, in short, a kind of household risk insurance, made up of her own foresight and her own small reserves, and her own careful prioritization of competing demands. But sometimes the emergencies were too large for her contingency fund. The icebox needed a major repair, or had to be replaced entirely. The car needed a new transmission. The child needed unexpected dental work. And in these cases, she would have to go to her husband and ask for additional money. And the asking was, again, a small negotiation, a small moment of dependence, a small reminder of who controlled the family's larger resources. In the best marriages, these conversations were friendly and collaborative. The husband and wife sat down together. They discussed the problem. They looked at the family savings. They made a joint decision about how to handle it. In less good marriages, the conversations were tense. The husband questioned whether the expense was really necessary. The wife defended her judgment. There was sometimes a quiet argument, a small wounding exchange, a lingering resentment that would settle into the bones of the marriage and contribute over the years to the slow erosion of intimacy and trust. The young woman in our story has had a few of these conversations over the years of her marriage. She has, on the whole, found her husband reasonable. He has not, in most cases, made her feel guilty about the expenses she has had to bring to him. He has not, in most cases, refused her request outright. But there have been moments here and there when she has felt his hesitation, his small wave of resistance, his quiet calculation of whether the expense was really justified. And she has, in those moments, felt the smallness of her own position, the structural weakness of needing to ask, the slow accumulated weight of being on the receiving end of the family's financial decisions. She has, in response, become better at anticipating these moments. She's learned to mention small upcoming expenses casually, weeks in advance, so that her husband has time to adjust to the idea before the actual money is required. She has learned to present problems with their solutions already suggested, so that the husband does not have to do the work of thinking through what to do. She has learned, in short, to do much of the financial planning of the marriage herself, in her own head, in advance, so that the moment of asking is as smooth and as quick and as painless as possible. This is, again, the invisible labour of the housewife. Not just the cooking and the cleaning, but the careful diplomatic management of the family's financial life, conducted entirely in her own mind, with no one to consult and no one to thank her for it. She is, in some sense, the unseen architect of the family economy. She is the one who keeps the small machinery running smoothly. She is the one who absorbs the friction, who anticipates the difficulties, who navigates the small dangerous corners of household financial life with a competence that her husband and her children almost never see. Let us think also about the role of the extended family in the household economy. In the 1950s, even in the new suburbs, families were often closer to their parents and siblings and cousins than would be typical in later decades. The young housewife in our story has her mother living about an hour's drive away. She has her in-laws living in the same town just across the river. She has 2 sisters and a brother scattered across the state. She has on her husband's side an array of aunts and uncles and cousins of varying degrees of closeness, and the small economy of her household is in many ways woven into the larger economy of this extended family network. There are exchanges of food, for instance. The mother-in-law brings over fresh tomatoes from her garden in August, and the young woman sends back a jar of homemade pickles. The sister-in-law shares the apples from her tree, and the young woman returns the favour with a small basket of cookies. The aunt sends a yearly Christmas fruitcake, which the family pretends to enjoy, and which sits on the counter for weeks before being quietly disposed of. The cousin who works at the bakery sometimes brings over day-old bread and pastries, which the children love. The neighbour across the street who has a vegetable garden often slips a bag of zucchini or beans or fresh herbs into the young woman's hands when they meet at the mailbox. These small exchanges add up. They are not in any single instance large or significant, but over the course of a year, they represent a meaningful supplement to the household food supply, a small system of mutual aid that the young housewife participates in and benefits from. She would not exactly call it that. She would not think of her mother-in-law's tomatoes as economic support. She would think of them as a small kindness, a small expression of family affection. But they are, in their small way, a real contribution to the food on her table, and she is grateful for them, and she reciprocates with her own small kindnesses, and the slow, informal economy of the extended family continues in its small, steady way, year after year. There are also exchanges of labour. The mother-in-law comes over occasionally to help with the children, allowing the young woman a small afternoon to herself. The sister-in-law shares childcare during the school holidays, when the children's energy can otherwise be overwhelming. The brother, who is a carpenter, comes over to help with small home repairs that the husband cannot manage on his own. The cousin who has a sewing machine helps with the children's costumes for the school plays. These exchanges too are not thought of as economic, but they are in their small way real economic contributions to the running of the household. They save money, they save time, they make the small careful machinery of household life run more smoothly than it could on the young woman's labour alone. And there are exchanges of money, occasionally. The mother sends a small cheque at Christmas, with instructions that it is for the children, but which the young woman in fact uses to help pay for the family's Christmas dinner. The father-in-law slips a $20 bill into the young woman's hand at the end of a visit, with a wink and a quiet, "This is just between us," suggesting that he understands the difficulties of the housekeeping budget better than his son does. The sister, who is single and working as a schoolteacher, occasionally sends a small gift of money on the children's birthdays, more than she can really afford, more than she's asked for, simply because she loves them and wants to contribute. These small monetary gifts are, in some sense, the most interesting feature of the extended family economy. They flow, often, in directions that the formal economic system would not predict. They flow from grandparents to grandchildren, but also, through the grandchildren, indirectly to the parents. They flow from siblings to siblings, often from those with more resources to those with less. They flow, in many cases, specifically through the women of the family, who are aware, in ways the men often are not, of which households are struggling and which households are doing well, and who direct their small acts of generosity accordingly. This is, again, a small unrecognised form of female economic agency. The housewife may not control the larger household money, but she controls, in many cases, the flow of small gifts and small kindnesses and small acts of mutual aid that pass through the extended family. She decides which sister-in-law to invite to dinner this week. She decides which niece to send a small birthday card to. She decides which cousin to call when there is trouble. She is, in her own small way, the manager of the family's social and emotional and economic ties. Even when she is not the manager of its formal finances, let us turn now in this gentle late stretch of the evening to consider some of the smaller voices of the 1950s, the women whose lives did not fit the standard suburban model and whose experiences were, therefore, even further from the official narrative of cheerful housewifery. There were, for instance, the single working women of the 1950s, who lived in their own apartments, in the cities, earning their own paychecks, managing their own money. They were a minority, but they existed. They were school teachers and secretaries and nurses and shop assistants, and the occasional young professional woman in journalism or law or medicine. They lived in small one-bedroom apartments. They cooked their own dinners on small gas stoves. They paid their own rent and their own utility bills and their own grocery bills. They were, in some sense, the demonstration that women could in fact manage their own economic lives given the chance. They were, in some sense, the silent counter-argument to the entire housekeeping allowance system. These single women were not, by and large, celebrated in the popular culture of the 1950s. The magazines did not feature them. The advertisements did not court them. The television shows did not centre them. They were, in the dominant narrative, slightly suspect figures, women who had not for some reason married, women who were perhaps to be pitied or perhaps to be quietly judged. women whose lives were assumed to be incomplete because they had not been folded into the structure of marriage and motherhood. But they were there. They were managing. They were, in their own quiet way, demonstrating that women could in fact be full economic actors, that the housekeeping allowance system was not the only possible arrangement, that an alternative existed and could be lived. And these single women, when they did marry, often did so later than their counterparts, and brought into the marriage a different set of expectations. They had, by the time they married, already managed their own finances for years. They knew how to budget, they knew how to save, they knew how to make economic decisions on their own, and they sometimes found, when they entered the housekeeping allowance system as wives, that the transition was particularly difficult. They had to give up powers they had exercised on their own. They had to learn, often with some difficulty, to ask permission for purchases they had previously made without consulting anyone. They had to fold themselves into a system that, for women who had not experienced independence, was simply the natural way of things, but for women who had, felt like a small contraction of their lives. There were also, in the 1950s, the working-class wives, whose experience of the housekeeping allowance system was rather different from that of their middle-class counterparts. In the working-class neighbourhoods of American cities, in the industrial towns of the English Midlands and the Scottish Lowlands, in the factory districts of every major Western country, women lived in tighter circumstances and managed smaller budgets and faced more frequent emergencies than the suburban housewife. They often worked outside the home themselves in factories or laundries or service jobs, even if they were married. They contributed to the household budget more openly. They had, in many ways, more equal say in family finances, simply because they were themselves earning a portion of the family money. But they also had less. The dollars they managed were fewer. The space they lived in was smaller. The food they could afford was simpler. The clothes they wore were more worn. And the husband, who was perhaps a factory worker or a dock worker or a coal miner, was often more physically exhausted, more prone to small daily resentments, sometimes more inclined to spend his pay on drink before he came home. The working-class wife, in many cases, had to fight harder for her share of the family money than her middle-class sister did. The housekeeping system was, for her, more openly an economic struggle and less a polite social ritual. And there were the black women of the 1950s, in the United States, whose experience was different again. In the segregated cities of the American South, in the urban neighbourhoods of the North that had received the Great Migration, black women managed their households in conditions shaped by the deep economic discriminations of American racial life. They often worked outside the home, even when married, because their husbands' wages, if their husbands were employed at all, were rarely enough to support a family. They worked as domestic servants, as cooks, as cleaners, as laundresses. They worked, in many cases, in the very homes of the white middle-class housewives whose lives we have been considering tonight. The black domestic worker would walk to the bus stop in the early morning, ride across town to the white neighbourhood, spend her day cooking and cleaning and caring for the white family's children, and then ride home in the evening to her own family, her own home, her own children, her own work that still needed to be done. The black women who worked as domestic servants in the 1950s were, in some sense, the structural foundation of the white suburban housewife's life. The white housewife, in her gleaming kitchen with her shiny appliances, was often able to maintain her standards of cleanliness and order because a black woman came in 2 or 3 times a week to help with the heavier cleaning. The white mother of 3 or 4 small children was often able to take her afternoon nap, or read her magazines, or have her tea with her friends because a black woman was minding the children. The white family was often able to entertain large dinner parties on the weekend because a black cook had been hired to prepare the food. The full picture of 1950s middle-class American domestic life is incomplete without an acknowledgement of the black women's labour that supported so much of it, and the deep racial inequalities of pay and opportunity that made that labour available so cheaply. The black women who worked as domestic servants were paid, often by the white housewife, out of the white housewife's housekeeping money. The transaction was small and personal. The white housewife would count out a few dollars at the end of the day, perhaps 3 or 4 for a day's work, and place them in the black woman's hand. The black woman would take the money, thank her employer, and walk to the bus stop to go home. And in this small daily transaction, 2 women whose lives were profoundly shaped by the larger structures of mid-century America met briefly, exchanged a few words, and parted to return to their separate worlds. The young woman in our story does not have a domestic helper, Her budget does not stretch quite that far. She does her own cleaning, her own cooking, her own childcare. But many of her neighbours do have helpers, and the small black woman who comes to her neighbour's house on Tuesday mornings is a familiar figure on the street. The young woman waves to her, sometimes, when she passes on the sidewalk. They have exchanged a few small pleasantries about the weather. They do not, of course, know each other in any deeper sense. The structures of the time do not really allow for that. But there is, in their small daily nods and small daily acknowledgements, a small thread of mutual recognition. They are both women working hard for their families. They are both in different ways doing the long invisible labour that holds the world together. Let us think also about the immigrant women of the 1950s, who were arriving in the United States in significant numbers from Italy and Greece and Ireland and the Eastern European countries, who were bringing with them their own traditions of household management, their own ways of cooking and cleaning and managing money, their own languages and accents and small private homesicknesses. These women navigated the housekeeping allowance system in their own particular ways, often combining the American customs they were learning with the customs they had brought from home. They cooked Italian sauces in American kitchens. They taught their American-born children to speak the old language at home. They sent small portions of the family money back to relatives in the old country when they could. They managed, in their own small ways, the difficult task of being both new Americans and old Italians or old Greeks or old Irish at the same time. And there were, of course, the women on the edges of the social order, the women in difficult marriages, the women whose husbands beat them, the women whose husbands left them, the women whose husbands drank or gambled or simply failed to provide. These women faced the housekeeping allowance system in its harshest form. There was for them no kindly weekly envelope. There was only struggle and absence and the daily question of how to feed the children with money that did not exist. And the formal structures of mid-century society were, in most cases, ill-equipped to help them. The legal system favoured the husband. The welfare system, where it existed, was small and stigmatised. The neighbourhoods could help only so much. The churches could offer only small charities. These women survived often on their own ingenuity and the small kindnesses of other women and the slow accumulation of small private resources. And many of them, in time, became the loudest advocates for the legal reforms that would, in the 1960s and 70s, begin to transform the position of married women in American and British and Western life. Let us consider, too, the rural housewives of the 1950s, the women who lived not in the new suburbs or the old cities, but on the small family farms that still, in this decade, dotted the American countryside in great numbers. The rural housewife's economic life was different again from her suburban sisters, in ways that were both harder and in some respects more straightforward. She did not, in most cases, receive a weekly housekeeping envelope. The money on a small family farm did not arrive in regular paychecks. It arrived in irregular lumps when the crop was sold in the autumn, when the cattle were sold at market, when the milk check came once a month from the local creamery, and the rural housewife had to manage the family's budget across these long irregular intervals, stretching the autumn money through the long winter, planning for the spring planting expenses, saving small portions of every check against the inevitable emergencies of farm life. The rural housewife was, in many cases, more openly an economic partner in the family enterprise than the suburban housewife was. She kept the books in many farms. She wrote the checks for the seed and the fertilizer and the small mechanical parts that the husband needed. She negotiated with the feed salesman who came up the dirt road in his small truck. She set the prices on the eggs and the small jars of preserved tomatoes that she sold at the roadside stand in the summer. She earned, often, her own small portion of the family income, from the chickens or the small dairy or the kitchen garden or the small bed and breakfast room that she rented to travelling salesmen in the warm months. Her economic contribution was visible and direct and acknowledged, and her position within the family economy was, in consequence, slightly less infantilizing than the position of the suburban housewife with her weekly envelope. But the rural housewife also worked harder in many ways than her suburban counterpart. She rose at 4 a.m. to milk the cows. She gathered the eggs from the chicken coop in the small grey hours of dawn. She cooked 3 large meals a day for a family that included not just her husband and children, but often hired hands during the planting and harvest seasons. She canned and preserved and pickled and dried, in the late summer, hundreds of jars of food that would feed the family through the long winter. She sewed her own clothes and her children's clothes. She tended the small herb garden that supplied the family's seasonings. She cared for the family's small medicinal needs with home remedies passed down from her own mother and grandmother. Her labour was unending and varied, and in its small daily way, absolutely essential to the survival of the family enterprise. The rural kitchen in 1955 did not always have the gleaming appliances of the suburban kitchen. Many farmhouses still cooked on wood stoves. Many still drew their water from a hand pump in the yard or a small well in the basement. Many still had no refrigerator, but only an icebox that was filled twice a week with blocks of ice delivered by the local iceman. Many still relied on root cellars for the storage of potatoes and apples and onions through the winter. The rural housewife's world was, in many respects, closer to the world of her own grandmother than to the world of her suburban contemporaries. She lived, in some sense, in a slightly older America, an America that was still, in 1955, very much present, but that was beginning slowly to recede. And the rural housewife's relationship with money, in particular, had its own particular textures. She thought of money less as a regular flow, and more as a series of small lumps and gaps. She thought of expenses less as weekly outlays and more as seasonal rhythms. She knew, with a deep instinctive certainty, that the heating oil had to be ordered before the first cold snap of autumn, that the seed had to be paid for before the spring planting, that the children's school clothes had to be bought in the late summer before the new school year began. She managed in her own way a kind of long, slow agricultural budget, one that traced the cycles of the seasons rather than the cycles of the calendar week. Let us pause too on the older women of the 1950s, the grandmothers, the women who had been young in the 1920s and the 19-teens, the women who remembered the First World War and the great influenza of 1918 and the long, lean years of the Great Depression. These older women watched their daughters and daughters-in-law navigate the new affluent post-war world with a complicated mixture of pride and bewilderment. They had grown up in much harder circumstances. They had managed households on much smaller budgets. They had, in many cases, lived through years of real economic deprivation, when the question was not how to stretch a housekeeping envelope, but how to put any food on the table at all. The grandmother in the small white house at the edge of the suburban town, the mother of our young woman, would visit her daughter perhaps once a month. She would arrive in her small black car, driven by her own husband, who was a retired postal worker. She would bring small gifts, a jar of homemade preserves, a small loaf of bread she'd baked that morning, a tiny dress she had sewn for the youngest grandchild. She would settle into the kitchen and watch her daughter cook and chat with her about the small news of the week. And she would notice, with the quiet observational eye of an older woman, the small details of her daughter's economic life, the new appliances, the well-stocked pantry, the small private fund hidden behind the canned tomatoes that her daughter had once, in a moment of quiet confession, told her about. The grandmother had her own small private fund, of course. Every woman of her generation had one. She had, since the early years of her own marriage, kept a small portion of every grocery dollar tucked away in a small tin box in the bottom drawer of her dressing table. Her husband had never known about it. Her children had never known about it. It had grown, slowly, over 40 years of marriage, to a sum that was, by 1955, surprisingly substantial, a small inheritance in waiting, a small monument to 4 decades of patient invisible economic agency. She would, in time, leave portions of it to her grandchildren in her will, and her grandchildren, when they received these small bequests, would not, in most cases, understand what they were receiving or how it had been accumulated. But the grandmother, looking at her daughter's small private fund in the pantry, recognized it instantly, recognized it with a small smile, recognized that her daughter was carrying forward a tradition that stretched back generations into the small, unrecorded history of women's quiet economic life. These older women had stories that they sometimes told when the kitchen was quiet and the grandchildren were playing outside and the afternoon was long and slow. They told stories about the Great Depression, when their own husbands had been laid off from their jobs, when the family had eaten potato soup 5 nights a week for an entire winter, when the small, careful management of pennies had been the difference between getting by and going under. They told stories about the war, when their sons had gone overseas and their daughters had taken jobs in factories and their own household responsibilities had multiplied. They told stories about the long earlier century, the century in which they had grown up, the century in which a married woman's economic position had been even more constrained than it was in 1955. The young woman, listening to her mother's stories in the small suburban kitchen, would sometimes feel a complicated set of feelings about her own position. She would feel, on one hand, grateful for the relative ease of her own circumstances, the new appliances, the steady paycheck, the small private fund, the small dignified suburban house. She would feel, on the other hand, a small uneasy recognition that her own difficulties, her own small daily frustrations with the housekeeping envelope and the asking and the financial dependence, were not so different from her mother's difficulties had been, were in fact a continuation of an old long pattern that had not yet in 1955 fully ended. Let's think too about the daughters of the 1950s, the small girls who were growing up in these households, who were watching their mothers manage the housekeeping envelopes and keep the small private funds and ask their fathers carefully for additional money when the household budget could not stretch. These small girls were absorbing, often without quite knowing they were absorbing, a complicated set of lessons about money and gender and economic agency. They were learning on one hand that women were skilled and resourceful and capable of running complex small operations on limited budgets. They were learning on the other hand that women were not, in the formal structures of the adult world, fully economic agents in their own right, that they had to ask, that they had to negotiate, that they had to maintain their small private funds in secret in order to have any economic independence at all. These small girls growing up in the 1950s would become, in the 1960s and 70s, the young women who would push hardest for the legal reforms that would transform the position of married women in American life. They had watched their mothers, they had learned what they had learned, and they had decided with a small, quiet determination that would eventually become a great national movement that they would not themselves live the lives their mothers had lived. They would have their own bank accounts, they would have their own credit cards, they would have their own paychecks. They would not, when they married, fold themselves into a system that infantilized them. They would be instead equal economic partners in their marriages, with their own money and their own dignity and their own clean economic standing in the world. This generational transformation, which began in the small suburban kitchens of the 1950s, as the daughters watched their mothers count out their housekeeping money on the kitchen table, was one of the most profound social changes of the 20th century. It did not happen all at once. It did not happen evenly. It did not happen without struggle and pain and small private disappointments. But it happened slowly, surely, irrevocably, over the long course of the second half of the 20th century, and the small girls who had once watched their mothers asking their fathers for grocery money would, by the end of their own lives, have built a world in which their own daughters and granddaughters would never have to do the same thing. Let us think also about the small objects of the 1950s housewife's economic life, the small physical things that gathered around her like the small props of a long ongoing play. The small ledger book, of course, with its careful columns of figures, the small envelope refilled each week with new bills, the small tin box at the back of the cupboard with its accumulated small savings, the small green coupon books from the grocery store, with their stamped pages and their promise of small free gifts after enough purchases had been made, the small recipe box on the kitchen counter with its careful index cards, each one representing a meal that had been planned, ingredients that had been priced, a small economic decision that had been made. These small objects were the physical infrastructure of the housewife's economic life. They were the tools of her trade. They were, in many cases, the only material evidence of the long, careful labour she was doing. They sat on the counters and in the drawers and at the back of the cupboards, modest and small and easily overlooked, but cumulatively essential to the running of the household, and the women who used them developed, over the years, small intimate relationships with them. The ledger book that had been used for 10 years had a particular curve to its spine, a particular smudge on its cover, a particular way of falling open to certain frequently used pages. The recipe box had a particular smell, a mixture of paper and ink and the faint residues of long-ago cooking. The small tin box at the back of the cupboard had a particular cool weight when you picked it up, a particular satisfying click when you opened its lid. These objects, in their small way, were companions to the women who used them. They were the silent witnesses of decades of careful arithmetic. They were the small physical anchors of a long invisible labour, and when these women in time grew old and died, the objects passed often to their daughters and granddaughters, who in many cases did not fully understand what they were inheriting. The ledger book would be opened, decades later, by a granddaughter who had grown up in a world of credit cards and bank accounts and online banking, and the granddaughter would look at the careful columns of figures and feel a small, mysterious sense of presence, a small recognition that her grandmother had once sat at a kitchen table and recorded in this very book the small daily decisions that had built the family she had eventually been born into. Let us also think about the small rituals of money in the 1950s household, the small repeated ceremonies that gave structure to the family's economic life. There was the Friday evening ritual when the husband returned from work with his paycheck in his wallet, and the family sat down to dinner, and after dinner the husband and wife retreated to the kitchen table for the small weekly conference about the housekeeping money. There was the Saturday morning ritual when the wife took her envelope and her shopping list and her small purse and walked out to the family car and drove to the supermarket. There was the Sunday afternoon ritual when many families spent some quiet hour going through the small financial paperwork of the week, sorting bills, writing checks, balancing whatever small balances needed to be balanced. These rituals were not, in any individual instance, particularly remarkable. They were small, they were quiet, they were repeated week after week, year after year, with the slow patient rhythm of all domestic life. But cumulatively they shaped the rhythm of the family week. They gave structure to the economic life of the household. They marked, in their own small way, the passage of time, the slow accumulation of weeks into months and months into years and years into the long stretch of a marriage and a family and a life. The young woman in our story has lived these rituals for the 7 years of her marriage. She knows them as deeply as she knows the small physical layout of her own house. She knows the Friday evening conference. She knows the Saturday morning shopping trip. She knows the Sunday afternoon paperwork. She has, in some sense, become her rituals. The slow, careful, repetitive labour of the housekeeping budget has shaped her, has become a part of her, has woven itself into the deep texture of her daily life. And there is, in this, both a kind of constraint and a kind of dignity. The constraint is obvious. She is bound to a system that limits her economic agency, that infantilizes her, that requires her to negotiate for every dollar she spends. The dignity is more subtle. She's doing real work. She's doing skilled work. She's doing work that, if she did it badly, would have real consequences for her family's well-being. The small daily competence that she has developed over the years is a competence she can be proud of, even if the larger structures of her society give her little explicit recognition for it. We are, in our long meditative wandering, beginning to see her not just as a victim of a particular economic arrangement, but as a skilled practitioner of a particular kind of household art. She is, in her own way, a craftswoman. The craft is the household economy. The materials are dollars and pennies and the small flow of weekly money. The product is a family fed, clothed, housed, raised, sent into the world, with small private hopes and small private dignities intact. And the craft, like all crafts, requires long patient practice and small daily attention, and the slow accumulation of small skills over years and decades. Let's think finally about the slow turning of the seasons in the 1950s suburban year, and about how those seasonal rhythms shaped the housewife's relationship to money and time. The year began, in some sense, in September, when the children returned to school and the household settled into its long autumn rhythm. The housewife in those weeks was occupied with the small expenses of the new school year, the new pencils and notebooks and lunch boxes, the small new dresses and small new pairs of shoes that had to be bought before the first cold mornings arrived. She managed these expenses carefully, having anticipated them through the summer, having set aside small portions of her weekly money for exactly this purpose. Autumn was, for the housewife, a season of small accumulations. She watched the leaves change colour on the maple trees that lined her quiet street. She watched the small pumpkins ripen in the front gardens of her neighbours. She watched the heating oil truck make its first deliveries of the season to the houses on the block. She watched the small children walking to school with their new books and their new clothes and their small private new beginnings. And she managed, all the while, the slow accumulation of the family's autumn expenses, the small careful budget for Halloween candy, the slightly larger budget for Thanksgiving, the much larger budget for Christmas that she had been quietly building since the previous January. Winter came, and the household drew inward. The kitchen became, more than ever, the centre of family life. The housewife cooked heavier meals, warmer meals, meals that filled the house with the smells of slow-roasted meats and simmering soups, and small pies cooling on the windowsill. She managed the small additional expenses of winter, the higher heating bills, the small repairs to the boiler that always seemed to need attention in January, the small medical bills that came when the children inevitably caught the flu. She watched the snow accumulate on the small driveway outside her kitchen window. She watched her husband shovel that snow in the early mornings before he left for work. She watched the small icicles form on the eaves of the house and slowly grow longer through the long cold weeks. Spring arrived and the household stirred. The housewife began to think about the small spring cleaning that needed to be done. She began to plan the small spring garden that would, by midsummer, supply the family with fresh tomatoes and small beans and a few herbs. She began to look at the children's small bodies and recognise that they would need new clothes for the warm weather, that they had grown over the winter, and that the small dresses and small shorts from last summer would no longer fit. She began the small new round of seasonal expenses that spring always brought, and she managed them as she had managed the small expenses of autumn and winter, with the careful, patient skill that was now, after 7 years of marriage, deeply natural to her. Summer came, and the household opened up. The children spent their long days running in the small backyards and on the small streets of the neighbourhood. The housewife cooked lighter meals, made small salads from the early vegetables of the kitchen garden, prepared cold suppers on the hottest evenings. She managed the small expenses of summer, the small ice cream treats for the children, the small day trips to the lake, the small repairs to the small wading pool in the backyard. She paid the small grocery bills, which were slightly lower in the summer because of the kitchen garden's small contributions. She set aside small portions of her weekly money against the autumn expenses that would soon enough return. And so the year turned, and turned again, and the small, careful arithmetic of the housekeeping budget moved through its long, slow, seasonal rhythms, year after year, decade after decade, in the small suburban kitchens of the 1950s American world. Let us think also about the small evenings of those years, the small quiet hours after the children had been put to bed and the dishes had been done and the kitchen had been wiped down for the night. The housewife would sit sometimes alone in the small living room with her small basket of mending or her small book or her small magazine in her lap, while her husband read his newspaper in his small chair by the lamp. The small evening would settle around them, gentle and unremarkable like every other evening of their long quiet marriage. The small clock on the mantel would tick. The small dog would breathe softly on the small rug by the fireplace. The small house would creak and settle with the small movements that all small houses make in the long quiet hours of the night. And in these small evenings the housewife would sometimes think about her life. She would think about the small budget she had managed that week, the small economies she had made, the small private fund she was slowly building. She would think about her two small sons, asleep in their small beds upstairs, and the small futures that lay before them. She would think about her own girlhood, now seeming so distant, when she had dreamed of being a teacher, when she had not yet imagined the small, careful life she would eventually build. She would think about the small daily satisfactions of her own competence, the small daily frustrations of her own dependence, the small daily texture of being a woman in this particular time and this particular place. These small evening reflections were not, in most cases, dramatic. They did not produce any small great decisions or small great changes. They simply happened, quietly, in the small living rooms of the small suburban houses of the 1950s, while the small clocks ticked, and the small dogs breathed, and the small lights of the small neighbourhoods glowed gently against the great dark sky of an American summer, or autumn, or winter, or spring night. And in this, perhaps, lies the deepest truth of the 1950s housewife's life. It was not, in most cases, a dramatic life. It was not, in most cases, a life of great events or great changes. It was a small life, in many ways, a life lived within the small walls of the small house, on the small street in the small neighbourhood in the small town. But it was, within those small walls, a full life, a real life. A life of small daily competence and small daily skill and small daily endurance. A life of small private dignities and small private dreams. A life that, in its small careful way, built something, raised something, made something, contributed something to the long slow river of human existence that flows always gently beneath the small surface of all our days. We have come a long way tonight. We have walked through many kitchens. We have visited many women, we have seen the housekeeping system from many angles, in many forms, in many lives, and we are now very near the end of our long quiet journey. Let us pause one more time to think about the young woman in our small suburban kitchen, with whom we have spent the bulk of this night. Let us think about her future, briefly, in the long unfolding decades that lay ahead of her in 1955. She would, in time, see her children grow. The two small boys who are now scampering about her yard would, in the late 1960s, become long-haired young men in college, attending protests against the war in Vietnam, wearing tie-dyed shirts and bell-bottom jeans, listening to music that their parents could not understand. She would, in time, watch the country change. She would watch the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the great cultural upheavals of the 1960s unfold on her small television set in the corner of her living room. She would, in time, read Betty Friedan's book when it came out, and she would recognize with a small jolt of surprise that the discontent she had felt in her own life was shared by millions of other women, were not in fact her own private failings but the result of larger structural problems. She would, in 1968, when she was 41 years old, open her first independent bank account. It would be a small joint savings account, technically still in both her name and her husband's, but with a separate passbook that she would keep herself, with money in it that she would manage on her own. The bank manager, by 1968, would not require her husband's signature. The world had begun to change, the small old structures had begun to bend, and the young woman, who was no longer quite so young, would walk out of the bank with her small new passbook in her purse and feel, for the first time in her adult life, a kind of small, clean economic standing that was hers and hers alone. She would, in 1974, when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed, apply for her first credit card in her own name. She would be approved. She would receive the card in the mail with her own name embossed on it, and she would look at it for a long moment in the kitchen where she had spent so many years of her life, and she would think, quietly, that the small daughter she had once been, the girl who had dreamed of being a teacher, would be, perhaps, satisfied to know that this had come to be. She would, in 1982, after 33 years of marriage, lose her husband to a sudden heart attack. She would discover, in the difficult months that followed, that he had, throughout their marriage, been less financially prudent than she had thought. The savings were smaller than she had been led to believe. There were small debts that she had not known about. The pension, while adequate, was not as generous as she had hoped. She would have to, at the age of 55, make some serious adjustments to her way of life. She would sell the suburban house. She would move to a small apartment in town near her sister. She would, for the first time in her adult life, take a part-time job, working 3 days a week at the local library, where she had once dreamed of working when she was a young woman. She would be, in these years, not quite poor, but not comfortable either. She would manage. She would make do. She would draw on the long, careful experience of decades of household budgeting to navigate her new, smaller, more independent life. And she would, in her later years, talk to her grown sons about the long arc of her life. She would tell them, sometimes in small fragments, about the housekeeping envelopes and the small private funds in the pantry and the bicycle in the window of the second-hand shop. She would tell them about the careful counting of dollars and the slow accumulation of small economic competence. She would tell them about the world she had lived in, the world that had, by the time she was telling them about it, mostly disappeared. The grandsons of 1990 would not, in most cases, fully understand what she was describing. The housekeeping allowance system would be, to them, a strange and distant historical curiosity, something that belonged to a different era, something that could be read about in books but not, anymore, lived. And the young woman, who was by then an elderly woman with white hair and a small comfortable apartment full of memories, would smile gently at her grandson's incomprehension and feel, in some deep sense, that this incomprehension was, perhaps, a kind of victory. She would live until 1998. She would die at the age of 71 peacefully in her small apartment, surrounded by her 2 sons and her 4 grandchildren. The small green ledger book that she had kept during the 1950s would be found, after her death, in a drawer in her bedroom, with all its careful columns of figures still intact, all its weekly balances still recorded, all its small testimonies to the long, unrecognized labor of a woman who had spent the prime of her life managing a household budget on the small folded bills that came home in her husband's pocket every Friday evening. But all of this is the future. In 1955, on this quiet summer evening, she is still young. She's still in her small suburban kitchen. She's still sleeping beside her husband, in the small bedroom of the small house, on the small street in the small American town. The small envelope of housekeeping money still waits in the cupboard above the stove. The small private fund still waits behind the row of canned tomatoes in the pantry. The small green ledger book still waits in the drawer beneath the kitchen table. The house is quiet. The street is quiet. The town is quiet. The country is quiet. The great gleaming post-war world, in all its prosperity and all its imperfection, is settling into the deep dark hours before dawn. The crickets are singing in the long grass. The dogs are sleeping on their rugs. The stars are wheeling slowly through the wide American sky. And the young woman, who does not yet know any of what is to come, who knows only her own small life and her own small world and her own small private dreams, sleeps peacefully beside her husband in the deep summer night of 1955, while the long slow rotation of history continues gently and inexorably beneath the surface of her ordinary days. We have stayed with her long enough. We have walked through her kitchens and her stores and her ledger books and her quiet afternoons. We have seen her budgets and her dreams and her small private kingdoms of independence. We have honoured her in the small way that storytelling can honour anyone, by paying close and patient attention to the small details of her ordinary and extraordinary life. Let us let her sleep now. Let us let the kitchen grow quiet. Let us let the lamp by her bedside, which had been left dimly burning by mistake, flicker once more and go out. Let us let the whole small house settle into the deep velvet silence of an American summer night. Let us let the embers of our own attention die down gently, like the embers of a fire that has done its slow good work